Well, there we are. Some kind of weird anomaly that was taking place, but it seems that it is fixed. I am glad that all of you can join me this early, early Monday morning. We are past Thanksgiving, so everybody has gotten their turkey and ham or turkey, as Joy Ann Reid talks about. Apparently, that she's eating at her Thanksgiving dinners. Nevertheless, we're here. It's early. I have a damn good show for you today. If you guys dig the content, please like, share, and subscribe. I know it's presumptive of me to say if you like it before we even get started, but I promise you we have a fantastic show for you today. Caleb Maupin is going to join us. Elijah Magier will join us. Elijah joining us is a big deal because the man has been doing this stuff for like 35 years. So he has my deep appreciation for coming on and giving us his take about what's taking place on the ground. He's been in those areas forever. So if anybody knows, he does. On top of that, we have Robert Patina. He's going to have this conversation about the ceasefire violations taking place in Gaza. We have Steve Gill and Ted Rall. Both of them are going to cross swords on the issue of domestic policy. And we have KJ No to deal with events taking place in China. So again, we have a damn good show for you today. And I am happy that you could join me for the show, the best damn morning show on domestic and international politics that you will find anywhere, period. Any reality, this show, best damn morning show. I want to talk about the events in Syria. The events in Syria have been rather astonishing. We've had jihadists, terrorists, who've changed their name to HTS, but whatever, they're terrorists. Al-Qaeda, ISIS, these type of motley crew groups that have been pushed by the U.S., Turkey, might as well say NATO forces, in order to go into Syria to create another front. And what I mean by another front is the reason for going into Syria, from my understanding, has more to do with this idea of undercutting the Syrian government's support for Hezbollah, but also from a NATO standpoint, they've lost in Ukraine. And because they've lost in Ukraine, they are now looking for another way to undermine, to undercut. The belief being that if you can take down Syria, you can take down support for Hezbollah in Lebanon, but you can also strike a blow to Russia because, again, this is an ally of Russia that Russia and Iran got involved in order to stabilize. The reason that Russia and Iran got involved to stabilize is because A, they don't necessarily want jihadis taking over the country. B, they know that the U.S. and those forces are not going to allow terrorists to stay in charge of Syria, in which case they will overthrow that terrorist government and put in their own patsy government that is dependent upon and backs U.S. NATO interests against Russia. They also know that Iran or Syria is a platform for Iran. If you remember, General Wesley Clark came out and said that our job, what we were trying to do was take down multiple governments. This is going back to the Bush administration, to take down multiple governments with the notion of finally getting to Iran. I've even had John Kiriakou on the show that had pointed out that the CIA had been working tirelessly in these countries in order to undermine these countries. And that when he was in position himself in the CIA, and he is sitting in a meeting, that Dick Cheney comes on and says, we are going to be in Iran in like a year or so. And they looked at each other like, did he just say Iran? Yes, they said Iran, despite the fact that they were squaring up at that time against Iraq. This is General Wesley Clark. Listen to what he says about this. I mean, it should be mind-blowing to any American to figure out, hey, we spent $10 trillion. Where did that $10 trillion go? Meaning, if you're looking at that debt, we're $30 trillion in debt. Okay.
About 10 days after 9/11, I went through.
How did that happen? Well, stuff like this. This is General Wesley Clark.
Pentagon, and I saw Secretary Rumsfeld and Deputy Secretary Wolfowitz. I went downstairs just to say hello to some of the people on the Joint Staff who used to work for me. And one of the generals called me and he said, "Sir, you got to come in. You got to come in and talk to me a second." I said, "Well, you're too busy." He said, No. He says, "We've made the decision. We're going to war with Iraq." This was on or about the 20th of September. I said, "We're going to war with Iraq. Why?" He said, "I don't know." He said, "I guess they don't know what else to do." So I said, "Well, did they find some information connecting Saddam to Al-Qaeda?" He said, No. He says, "There's nothing new that way. They just made the decision to go to war with Iraq." He said, "I guess it's like we don't know what to do about terrorists, but we've got a good military and we can take down governments." And he said, "I guess if the only tool you have is a hammer, every problem has to look like a nail." So I came back to see him a few weeks later, and by that time we were bombing in Afghanistan. I said, "Are we still going to war with Iraq?" And he said, "Oh, it's worse than that." He said, he reached over on his desk, he picked up a piece of paper, and he said, I just got this down from upstairs, meaning the Secretary of Defense's office today. And he said, "This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran." The truth.
That is exactly what we did. Think back through all the different administrations. That is exactly what we did. Through all the various administrations, through everything that basically took place, whether it was Bush, whether it was Obama, even Trump. If you think back, Donald Trump kept the oil. Donald Trump admitted that Obama got 500,000 people killed in Syria in a regime change war. It wasn't a civil war. But all of this talk about, oh, it's a civil war, except it wasn't a civil war. We supported, paid for, trained those people to do exactly what they did. And then we turned around and said, it's a civil war. So now we can get involved more. Obama said there's no boots on the ground. Obama lied. If you remember, after Obama left and Trump got in, the New York Times posted this $1 billion campaign that Obama was running to regime change in Syria. There were even reports about the U.S. military fighting CIA-backed groups or CIA-backed groups fighting groups paid for by the military. Okay, well, how does that happen? It's because we were directly involved in doing so. Wesley Clark is right. And it's something that went across multiple administrations. In fact, to make this clear, as I was pointing out with Trump, if you remember when Donald Trump stopped the program, he still kept the oil, meaning we lost the ability to overthrow the government. Okay, so we're going to freeze the conflict. And as we freeze the conflict, we're going to keep the oil. So we're going to occupy the areas with the wheat, and we're going to occupy the areas with the oil, because we don't want the Syrian government to be able to recombine itself, to be able to sustain itself. We want to try to bleed it dry. And that's effectively what they did, also using sanctions to assist with that goal and with that objective. Now, with them losing in Ukraine and knowing that they lost in Ukraine, and that the only way to do anything about the context of Ukraine is to go nuclear, what they've decided is to open up another front. They have all those terrorists that were in Idlib Turkish backed to invade. And I could show you videos of them beheading people. They may change the name, but they are effectively the same groups that were there prior. I want to point out something else. This is also why Russia is not going to accept a frozen conflict in Ukraine. Syria was a frozen conflict. Those terrorists can come back at any particular moment. I'm saying Russia is not going to allow the situation for Ukraine to go year after year, and then when the best opportunity strikes, for them to also rebuild the Ukrainian military into attack. The reason why I'm bringing that up is because there's been some floating of a frozen campaign. Hey, I don't know how you even have the capability to do that. Russia is moving faster and faster, and the Ukrainian military is taking more and more damage as we go along. So this idea that you're going to somehow freeze it, okay, how are you going to do that? If Ukraine could do that, they would have done that already. They will be doing it now. And bringing in 18-year-olds, kids, to go out and die, it's not going to change anything. Giving them attack Adams missiles, it's not going to change anything. Firing those missiles into Russia, it's not going to change anything. If Donald Trump believes he's going to come in and push for a frozen conflict, he's out of his mind. The war will continue. Syria is a great example of why that war will continue. So it is disgusting when you think about it. For God's sake, we're getting people killed. For what? Syria didn't attack us. Syria didn't attack our interests. Syria didn't do anything to us. We have been attacking them. The Russian military has gotten involved. It seems that Aleppo has fallen. Apparently, there are videos of them going into the presidential palace. By the same token, there are questions that should legitimately be asked. A, how did this happen? How did you get caught with your pants down? Why couldn't the Syrian military? This was being talked about in Telegram, apparently. Meaning this wasn't something that they were quiet about. They were bragging and boasting about this. So how did they allow something like this to take place with all of these people getting killed, beheaded, chopped up, etc.? If you don't believe me, here is Jeffrey Sachs saying the exact same thing about our interests, our attacks, and paying for these attacks on Syria.
They sent in the CIA to overthrow Assad. The CIA and Saudi Arabia together in covert operations tried to overthrow Assad. It was a disaster. Eventually, it brought in both ISIS as a splinter group to the jihadists that went in. It also brought in Russia. So we have been digging deeper and deeper and deeper. What we should do now is get out and not continue to throw missiles, not have a confrontation with Russia. 7 years has been a disaster under Obama, continuing under Trump. This is what I would call the permanent state. This is the CIA, this is Pentagon, wanting to keep Iran and Russia out of Syria, but no way to do that. And so we have made a proxy war in Syria. It's killed 500,000 people, displaced 10 million. And I'll say predictably so, because I predicted it 7 years ago that there was no way to do this and that it would make a complete chaos. So what I would plead to President Trump is get out, like his instinct told him, by the way.
Before, yeah.
That was his instinct. But then all the establishment, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Pentagon, everybody.
This was known. This wasn't a secret. These guys had invested billions into overthrowing the Syrian government. If you don't believe me, what about Joe Biden? Joe Biden has this famous clip where he comes out and he talks about all of these groups that were interested in overthrowing the government. And good, we have our guest here. I want to go to our guests.
Hi.
There you are. How you doing, man? You doing all right this morning?
I'm great. How about yourself?
I am doing great. I am disturbed let's say, about world events and the way things have been going. But Caleb, let me bring you in. Caleb Maupin is a speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, and author. In his new book, Kamala Harris and the Future of America, an essay in 3 parts, he examines the life of Kamala Harris and puts her rise to prominence in context of changing U.S. political discourse and geopolitical stage. Caleb, man, I really appreciate you joining me. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Caleb, I want to get into what is happening in Syria right now. And I want to get your take on this. So I guess the first question, it seems that Aleppo, or at the very least parts of Aleppo, has fallen. Why weren't they more aware? Meaning, how did they get caught unaware? Because the war had never stopped. The war was always frozen. And they knew that those terrorists, tens of thousands, were in Idlib. I would imagine they had to have intelligence that they were being trained, even trained by Ukrainian forces, no less, but still backed by Turkey, backed by NATO. How did they get caught so unaware in this moment?
Well, many people felt that the Syrian conflict had completely de-escalated. You'll recall that the Syrian government was readmitted into the Arab League, and that it seemed like almost a consensus among Western leaders that the conflict was over. The Syrian government was going to remain intact. And now it appears to me that Joe Biden and the American intelligence apparatus and, Pentagon military industrial complex, they're very afraid of what's going to happen when Donald Trump takes office. And so not only are they escalating the conflict in Ukraine and going full speed ahead, pedal to the metal, trying to escalate that conflict as much as they possibly can. They're trying to flare up yet another confrontation where Russia is on one side and NATO is on the other. Now, when it comes to Syria, let's understand why Russia and Syria have a close relationship. Syria, they were a colony of the French for many years, and it was under the leadership of Hafez Assad, Bashar Assad's father, that they became an independent socialist country with the ideology of Ba'athist Arab socialism. And it was with the help of the Soviet Union that they built their first hydroelectrical power plants. They built their medical system, which has been very widely praised by Avincia Journal of Medicine. And they wiped out illiteracy in the country, and they've had many achievements since the 1980s and 90s as a result of their anti-colonial revolution. Ba'athist Arab socialism is the ideology upon which they're based. The Communist Party is part of the coalition of the government. So is the Syrian Social Nationalist Party. And it's kind of a coalition of different socialist and anti-imperialist forces that have taken power under the leadership of the Ba'athist Arab Socialist government. And they have been big funders of Palestinian resistance over the years. They very much see themselves as coming out of anti-colonial struggles, etc. And because of that, they've been a target of the United States and of NATO for a long time. And also because of that, from the time they had their revolution, the Russians, the Soviet Union, was a big ally and friend that helped them industrialize and build. And they made a point of not pivoting toward an alliance with the U.S.-aligned Arab states, right? There was talk about would they build a pipeline for Saudi Arabia and Qatar. They rejected it, and they had plans to build a pipeline to help Iran export oil to the Mediterranean. There was a whole plan that they had where Iran, is a very rich oil producing country. They were going to build a pipeline connecting Iran to the Mediterranean so Iranian oil exports could greatly expand. They're allies of the Islamic Republic of Iran. And this is geopolitics, but it's been going on for quite some time. Since 2011, we've seen the killing in Syria continue. And there has been all kinds of lies in Western media. They've tried to say that this is a result of the Arab Spring protests. Well, there were many people who protested during the Arab Spring who wanted more transparency in the government, wanted more human rights, etc. And the overwhelming majority of the people that protested against the Syrian government in 2011 now support the government because the people fighting against them in the civil war are jihadists and extremists who want to set up, some kind of caliphate and set up some kind of Islamist government that would be, a flashback to the 1400s. And, you know, I mean, the Syrian government has protected the Christian community that have been a target of the Islamic jihadist extremists backed by the United States. The Syrian government has protected religious minorities, and that it's very clear that the victory of these forces that the United States is backing, which seemed to be completely, you know, at least, you know, almost entirely, you know, defeated. But now Biden is escalating their strength in the hopes of just creating as much of a mess as he possibly can before leaving office. It seemed those forces had been defeated, but they now are escalating. Look, the Syrian government is going to stay in power. There's no question about it. The Syrian people see the Syrian government as the force that is in opposition to jihadism, extremism, and chaos. They look at Iraq and how great Iraq has been doing since the USA overthrew the government. They look at Libya and how great Libya has been doing ever since the USA overthrew the government. And they say, do we want that to come here? No, we don't. And I guess the Syrian government, despite whatever its flaws, that is the force that is the opposition. Syria's relationship with China has really strengthened in the last couple of years. China has made a point of really escalating their, you know, economic trade deals and such with Syria. The Syrian government's going to remain in power.
I guess that was going to be the other question. Is the Syrian government strong enough to push these forces back? I saw that Russia had a punishing attack on the militants that were part of this kind of terrorist organization itself. Why didn't these warriors of Islam attack Israel? I mean, Israel had been murdering Muslims indiscriminately for the last year in Lebanon, Palestine, and even in Syria itself. So if they were this, you know, group that represents the interests of Islam, why no attacks on Israel in this case? I mean, you know, that should be one of the fascinating questions. And I understand that they may have thought this war was over, but those terrorists were still there. And more to the point, they were talking about the fact that they were going to attack Syria. So I don't know. I guess it will. I mean, I'm saying heads roll. That's probably a bad way to put it. But I mean, do you agree with the fact that they were failures, either in intelligence or in capability, that allowed this to take place?
Well, if you want to know why these forces are not attacking Israel, these forces were specifically cultivated during the Obama administration to believe that the primary enemy of Muslims is the Shia. And there's a whole current that developed after the overthrow of the Iraqi government. Iraq is majority Shia, but Saddam Hussein was a Sunni, and it was a secular government. It was not a religious government. It was a secular government under the Ba'ath government of Saddam Hussein that was overthrown.
Right.
And that after the overthrow of the Iraqi government, U.S. media really just started pushing the idea, well, there's going to be a Sunni Shia war. There's going to be a Sunni Shia war. I mean, it was like they were making it happen. The U.S. government gave everyone in Iraq an ID, a government ID that specifically listed their religious identity. Anyone who had any role in the previous government, down to like the local council or the local city manager, because you'd been part of the previous government, you were banned. And then all the government jobs were handed out on the basis of your religious identity. Are you Sunni? Are you Shia? Are you Kurdish? Etc. And because of that, obviously there was huge ethnic strife. Iran, their government, is a Shia Islamic government. And so Iran immediately did everything it could to, support and protect the Shia communities of Iraq. Then, as a result of that, you had the Sunni forces that very much hate Iran for, there was the Iraq-Iran war, there's ethnic conflict, etc. You had the Sunni forces then, who view Shias as apostates, as not true Muslims. You had them getting support from Saudi Arabia, and you had kind of a wing of what you might call radical Islam that developed that said that Shia Islam was the main enemy, that Shia Muslims are apostates, that Shia Muslims are not true Muslims, and what you call Takfiriism or Salafism, or Wahhabi Islam, the Saudi interpretation of Islam, that was widely promoted throughout the region, said that Iran was the main enemy, said that because Bashar Assad, he's technically a Shia Muslim, he's an obscure form of a Shia Muslim called an Alawite, and because Iran are Shia, that Iran is trying to take over the world and form a Shia caliphate or a Shia crescent, and that Shia Muslims are the main enemy. And these forces, you're asking why they didn't attack Israel, they are a particular wing of Wahhabi Islamic fanaticism. It comes out of the wing of Osama bin Laden and his kind of ideology, but it's a kind of a spin-off of that says Shia Muslims are the main enemy. And they want to overthrow the Syrian government because they see that Bashar Assad is an Alawite. They want to fight against Iran because they consider Iran to be the main, country that is promoting Shia Islam all over the region, and that they want to promote Islamic sectarianism rather than fight Israel. And ISIS is probably the biggest expression of this. We saw the ISIS terrorists, what they did, and they very much viewed Shia Muslims as apostates and thought their main aim was to kill Shia Muslims. They've carried out attacks against the Islamic Republic of Iran. Their focus was overthrowing the Syrian government. They also fought in Iraq against Shia militias and Shia organizations. And that's why they're not fighting Israel, is they believe the main enemy is Shia.
I see. Okay, fair enough. I accept that. Does it also have something to do with the fact that Israel was supporting, meaning I can show you articles where they pointed out that Israel was funding some of these groups and even showing Netanyahu at the hospitals that were treating many of the fighters that were fleeing from the battlefield into Israeli hospitals. Like, meaning it seems that Israel gave express support to this group, but I guess that makes sense. If this group was perfectly willing to go after certain groups of Muslims and not others, then Israel might have just seen them as an ally in that effort. But correct me if I'm wrong on that.
Well, no, you're not wrong. And the thing is that, Iran is the, Shia Muslim government, kind of the center of world Shia Islam. And it also just so happens Iran is the country that Israel considers to be its greatest enemy. So it would make sense that if there's a group of radical Muslims out there who think that their main focus should be on fighting and killing Shia Muslims, that Israel would back them. And evidence of that certainly existed. You alluded to those hospitals, right? And that there's the occupied Golan Heights, a territory of Syria that's been seized by Israel. And in the Golan Heights, there was medical assistance that was being given to, these kind of fighters and ISIS and other extremist fighters that were working against the Syrian government were being backed by Israel. That was clear. And it doesn't match what Israeli propaganda would tell you, right? Israel's supposed to be the bastion of civilization against and all Muslims are supposed to be barbaric, primitive, people. And that's Israel's this stronghold of civilization, and they're modern. And these are all barbaric, primitive Muslims. That's what Israeli propaganda tends to promote. But it seems like the most extreme and conservative and sectarian Muslims have been, to some degree or other, backed by Israel in their fight against the Syrian government, in their fight against Iran. And that doesn't match, right? And that U.S. mainstream media throughout all of this has really kind of depended on Americans' ignorance. There's a clown named Trevor Loudon who works for Epoch Times, and he made a film that was supposed to explain everything. It was called Soviet Islam. And it was supposed to explain Russia was the cause of Islamic terrorism around the world. And the image that he used to promote this film was Saddam Hussein shaking hands with Brezhnev. And I just looked at this and I'm just like, oh my goodness, Saddam Hussein was a secular leader. This is complete ignorance, right? And that, you're not supposed to realize that Saddam Hussein was a secular Arab nationalist, that Iran is Shia, that ISIS are Wahhabis who want to kill Shia. You're supposed to just think, oh, these are all a bunch of primitive people and we got to support Israel because they're not primitive like this. And it's much more complicated. There are different forces at play here in the Middle East and elsewhere. And Israel and the United States have been one of the main promoters of the most extreme and dangerous, forms of Islamic terrorism. We know Osama bin Laden got his start fighting the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. And I mean, I've always said to people, show me where Al-Qaeda was not on the side of the American government. Show me where ISIS was not on the side of the American government. The guy who blew up the concert in Manchester, you remember that horrendous bombing that happened a few years back. Well, that guy had been somebody who he and his father had gone to Libya and gotten supported by the British and the American government to fight against Gaddafi. and they were Islamic radical extremists who hated Gaddafi because he wasn't, you know, enough of a Muslim for them. He was secular and he had women in the government, etc. So they went around Libya bombing and killing and torturing people. And then they came back to Britain and decided to blow up a concert where you know, where some, you know, they thought, you know, this woman was scantily clad, it was sinful or whatever. You know, and that you go down the line, you know, these horrendous terrorist attacks that have happened in the United States, they tend to be done by forces that are supporting the United States. Who are the Tsarnaev brothers? You remember the Tsarnaev brothers who blew up the Boston Marathon? Well, they were Chechens, and their parents were Chechen separatists who were backed by the United States to fight against Russia, to try and break Chechnya away from Russia. And the Russian government actually flagged them and said to the United States, watch these Tsarnaev brothers. We've been tracking their activity online. We think they might be doing something. The American government didn't listen, and they blew up the Boston Marathon. You know, and there's many examples. The Pulse nightclub shooting. That guy, his father was an Afghan who was anti-Soviet, had been moving against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, and you know, that's where he came from. There was another bombing in New Jersey. I think the New Jersey bomber. Also, again, his father had been somebody who'd fought against the Soviet Union in Afghanistan, and that these are the most extreme Wahhabi fanatical forces that tend to be backed by the United States against kind of Arab nationalist or socialist or anti-imperialist governments. And because Americans think all Muslims are the same, and because people, you know, this is a different region, a different culture, a different history, we kind of don't see that the most dangerous and extreme Muslim radicals are the ones backed by the United States, and it's the more sensible, nationalistic, constructive forces, whether it's Arab nationalists or the Islamic Republic of Iran. They're the ones the U.S. government targets. So, you know, people have said, you know, we're supposedly fighting a war on terror, but really the United States has functioned as Al-Qaeda's air force for the last couple decades. And that we've, instead of fighting the terrorists, we've fought all the terrorists' enemies. Saddam Hussein was a secular Arab leader, was a big enemy of the terrorists. He's been overthrown, and now ISIS set up shop in Iraq, and it's been chaos ever since, right? Gaddafi was so actually cooperative with the war on terror. He even offered to torture people for the American government. And after 9/11, Gaddafi, you know, he's came forward. I said, I've been fighting these people for years. You know, please let's team up. Let's fight them. And the Syrian government said the same thing. Wow, Wahhabi, bin Laden, we've been fighting these people for years. Let's team up. Let's cooperate against them. Syria and Libya were both big supporters of the U.S. war on terror because they'd been dealing with the Wahhabi extremist fanatics that wanted to overthrow them, and they thought it was an opportunity to cooperate. Well, the United States is focused on overthrowing them. Meanwhile, the ideology that a lot of these folks have is Wahhabism, which comes from Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia has long been the biggest ally of the Western powers in the Middle East. You know, and I mean, the Saudi government, I mean, the very borders were drawn up by the British Empire. The British backed the Saudi forces. They were seen as kind of vassals and allies of the British Empire, and they are completely tied in with ExxonMobil, BP, and Shell, and Chevron, all the American oil companies. And so the way we kind of understand things is just completely twisted.
Yeah, it's very warped. I had a conversation with a good friend of mine last night, and as we were talking about the media, I was pointing out to him that, you know, it often feels like you're walking through a fog because of what they say. Like, they say stuff that is so twisted, or lack of context that pushes people into a certain point of view, and it's done constantly over and over and over again, especially if you're talking about governments that we don't necessarily like. Is it fair to say that this was never a civil war? Because the way they talked about it back during the Obama administration was there's the Arab Spring. You have all of these groups and these people who are very angry at the Syrian government, and being angry at the Syrian government, it flared up into a resistance against the government, in which case there was a civil war that various groups across the Middle East that hated the Syrian government joined in on. I mean, that was the narrative. Was this ever a civil war, though? I mean, for that matter, was Libya really a civil war, looking back on it? Give me your take on both of those.
Well, foreign fighters were essential in both of those conflicts, no question about it. I mean, there were protests in Libya and Syria and throughout the Middle East in 2011. Now, we know the American government had a lot to do with fomenting those protests, with the, with Twitter and Facebook, which were very new. Jared Andrew Cohen, who was working as the liaison between the Hillary Clinton State Department and the tech giants, Google, Facebook, Twitter, etc. And that certainly was a reality of how the Arab Spring happened, but it did represent what a lot of people in that region wanted. There was a lot of unemployment coming out of the financial crisis. There was a big drought, so a lot of the folks in the countryside were moving to the cities to try and find work, and so there were certain genuine sentiments that were kind of hijacked to just kind of create these widespread protests, and then what started out as widespread protests for a variety of reasons, you then had religious fanatical forces take control of it. And most of the people that protested against the Syrian government in 2011, most of them were secular to some degree or other, and most of them did not support the fanatical religious extremists who ultimately became the main force fighting against the Syrian government. So it's kind of a distortion to directly link them to the protests. It was the instability of the protests. It was kind of the unrest that created an opening for these forces. But foreign fighters were key in Libya. Foreign fighters were key and have always been key in Syria. Jordanians, people from throughout the region who were trained, who were, cultivated. In Turkey, they had training camps for them. In Jordan, they had training camps for them, and they would send them over the border to kill. And that's been essential. And that, the Libyan government was brought down, and Gaddafi defeated the insurgents on the battlefield every time. So then cruise missiles from NATO had to ultimately finish off the Libyan government because Gaddafi was going to win on the battlefield every time. In Syria, the Syrian government has been successful mainly because they've gotten support from Russia. They have the support of the population, no question about it. And then Russia was able to come to their aid. And because of that, the Syrian government remains intact. And that the Syrian government represents the bulk of the population. 80% of the people in Syria are Sunni Muslims. That is a very solid majority. But yet they, as a group, most Syrians line up with wanting to have a society where Christians are free to practice their faith, where different other religious minorities are free to practice their faith, where there's labor unions in the factories, where you have different political parties in the government, including not just the ruling Ba'athist Arab Socialist Party, but also the Communist Party, also the Syrian Social Nationalist Party. That Syria is for the region, right? I mean, look, who is it that the USA is aligned with? You got the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. You got the Kingdom of Qatar. You got the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. Right? These are countries that are not in any way democratic. They are ruled by ruling families who were given it, by the British. The British had the Sykes-Picot Agreement after World War I. They drew the borders of these countries. They picked, their most loyal, puppets, and they put them in charge of a region, and they became the absolute rulers. Qatar, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, etc. These are absolute monarchies. Whereas, it's the Syrian Arab Republic. And they have elections and they have different political parties. And you can argue that, there's corruption. You can argue there's problems, and there absolutely are. But these countries are at least, having having elections to some degree. And they have religious minorities that have roles in the government, and they have constitutions and laws. It's the Republic of Iraq under Saddam Hussein. It was it's the Islamic Republic of Iran. And these are countries that have established some form of independence that has led to kind of a government that is more representative of what the people there want. It's not just a monarchy that was imposed by the former colonizers. And again, people want to just sit back, and of course every criticism of the Iraqi government or the Syrian government or of the Iranian government comes up, and there's plenty of room for criticism there. But you have to admit, these countries are the more advanced and more progressive countries, and they're the ones the United States targets for that reason, because as far as the Western imperialists would like it, they see the Middle East as a giant, oil facility where they can extract the oil, and they really don't want development. They don't want these countries to rise up and industrialize and become, modern countries, whereas that is the aim of the Ba'athist element in Iraq and Syria, and that was also the aim of the Islamic Republic, is economic development, modernizing. And at one point in the 1980s, the Soviet Union was openly talking about a massive irrigation system, throughout that region, and kind of bringing the Middle East into the modern world with development as a way of bringing stability and resolving the Israel-Palestine conflict. And it's very tragic that the Soviet Union's plan for the region was never really put into effect, because if the Soviet Union had been able to work towards greening the deserts and bring economic development, etc., the Middle East wouldn't just be kind of the world's oil refinery. It would be something more prosperous, and you'd have less violence and instability. And I think that many people view the election of Menachem Begin in 1978, the hard right prime minister of Israel, as a negative turning point. Because there was some hope that, with the Soviet Union there, and with the rise of Baathism and Arab nationalism, that in the 70s, the Middle East could have gone in a good direction. But the rise of Menachem Begin and a number of forces, and then ultimately the fall of the Soviet Union, it's led things in a different direction. But I'm optimistic, because I hear not just, from modern Russia, but also from China, echoes of what the Soviet Union's plan for the Middle East was, peace through development. Because at the end of the day, right, if people have good paying jobs, if people have economic opportunity, they don't join terrorist groups. They don't join extremist groups. They don't become drug dealers. They don't become, terrorist killers. They enjoy economic prosperity. The way to bring peace is with economic development. That's why I'm excited about, what the Taliban is doing. It seems that the Taliban at this moment is pivoting towards some kind of economic development program. And as much as I'm not a fan of the Taliban and their ideology, etc., if they can bring economic development, that will bring stability to Afghanistan. And that is the road to peace. And that's also the road to human rights. The way we talk about human rights, I just want to say this. The way we talk about human rights in the West is completely messed up. We talk about it as if it's a moral thing, right? There's good countries that have freedom. There's bad countries that don't have freedom. Nobody anywhere in the world was talking about the rights of man, freedom of speech, freedom of religion until like the 1400s in Europe. Why? Because people were just evil until then? Well, no, because a level of economic development, the rise of modern capitalism, replacing feudalism, created a level of economic development in society that could facilitate that level of freedom. And that freedom is always intrinsically tied up with development and stability in any society. And we need to understand it that way.
Man, I am so glad you said that. One of my, I have, it's ideological, fair enough, but I tend to believe that if you leave countries to their own devices, that those countries would develop, meaning issues, and not just develop economically, but also develop from the standpoint of rights, like that human rights will come out of that level of economic development. It's not magic. It's not just something that comes out of the ether per se. I absolutely agree with you on that. On one of the other catches, and I also want to back up what you were pointing out about this Arab Spring. Our fingers were all over that. Seymour Hersh, back, when did he put this article out? I think back in like 2007, was talking about how there was a strategic shift into Syria and some of the other countries with the idea of destabilizing those countries to go after, well, Iran in that case, but these days it's going to be Russia's probably at the top of the list on that. I also want to play this clip by Joe Biden. This is a famous clip where Joe Biden is talking about all of the groups they were interested in getting involved in Syria and how all of the money was going into it. And I have a question for you after this clip.
What my constant cry was that our biggest problem is our allies.
It's a bit low. I hope you can hear it.
Our allies in the region were our largest problem in Syria. The Turks were great friends, and I have a great relationship with Erdogan, which I just spent a lot of time with. The Saudis.
All right, this clip is very hard to hear. What he's saying is the Turks, Saudis, all of these groups all around the world were putting in money, jihadis, etc., to overthrow the government of Syria. And of course, we were fully aware of it and were a party to it. I guess my question is, that's not true today, though, right? Like, from my understanding, the reporting came out that Saudi Arabia, UAE, even Qatar was against this, terrorist, Turkey-backed, NATO-backed terrorist group trying to overthrow Syria now, because Syria has been brought back into the fold, that there was a lot of diplomatic work that Syria was doing in order to ingratiate itself back into this kind of Arab League. In fact, they were even at the recent Arab League that last took place. So is it true that back in, let's say, 2007, all of these groups were involved in trying to overthrow the government, 2008, whatever the year was, but involved in trying to overthrow it? But today, the context of the Middle East has changed in such a way, but that's not what those countries want. What's your take on this? Is that true?
It's absolutely true, and that a lot has changed. And I've been telling people that essentially the Obama era strategy completely failed. Obama's strategy was to polarize the Muslim world and the Middle East between allies of Iran and allies of the United States. And that strategy continued in Donald Trump's first term. He went there to try and build an Arab NATO, et cetera. He did the Abraham Accords, trying to get Israel to be more friendly with the countries that were against Iran, but it's completely failed. And the first game changer was the conflict in Ukraine, because the United States made the demand on Saudi Arabia, you need to go all in and just go all in against Russia. And the Saudi monarchy was like, wait a second, Russia's got a huge amount of oil. We've got a huge amount of oil. We need to be able to call up the Russians on the phone, and they need to be able to call us on the phone, because the amount of oil that we put out on the market has a lot to do with the price going up and down, right? The price of oil goes up and down based on how much oil goes out. And so Saudi Arabia and Russia have to have a relationship in order, for the world economy to be stable. And so the demand that Saudi Arabia just completely cut all ties with Russia and join the bandwagon against Russia, the crown prince was just not going to do that. And so that was the beginning, that Saudi Arabia was just not all in against Russia when the Biden administration demanded it. And then the icing on the cake was October 7th and Israel's, campaign of aggression since then. The whole Muslim world is unified in opposition to it. And also the main people that, the main force that has been opposing Israel, the people who just kind of became the most, key fighters against Israel, were the Houthis in Yemen, that are an Iran-aligned group. And so everyone who opposed Israel was kind of cheering for the Houthis as they were blocking ships and engaging in their, solidarity with the Palestinians. And so the idea you're going to isolate Iran and its allies, that faded very quickly. And at this point, the Muslim world is just not buying into this idea that we need to be Sunnis versus Shia. We need to have the allies of Iran be isolated, and the allies of the United States can drift closer to Israel because Iran's the main threat. That's just not how the Muslim world sees things anymore. During the Obama administration, that perspective certainly took hold, but that's long gone. And at this point, Saudi Arabia, is willing, has sat down with the Islamic Republic of Iran in negotiations that were, facilitated by China. And now the two countries have diplomatic relations with each other. And Syria has been readmitted into the Arab League as a recognized government. And the Arab countries recognize Syria as the legitimate government. They're not, conferring support onto some rebel faction. And the Obama era strategy of polarizing the Middle East, it failed. I mean, it just completely failed. And now what Israel's doing is unifying Muslims even more. They're all united against what Israel is doing. And so, that strategy, the Sunni Shia conflict, the dividing, the Arab NATO, the Abraham Accords, that's all just forgotten. Just forget it.
I want to move to Trump for a bit. Yeah. And
Sure.
to one point, I want to move to Trump, but one more question on this.
Yeah.
This is a clear reason why Russia is not going to allow a frozen conflict, right? Like, all things being equal, like, the last thing they want is a situation where Zelensky recently came out and said, okay, we can cede territory, but we need to be part of NATO immediately. Okay, well, this is the frozen conflict stuff that was being floated. And, this idea that part of Ukraine is going to rebuild and then potentially launch another military invasion and being backed by NATO. Also, like, that is going to be outlandish. I don't even know how they would have the capability of even freezing the conflict if Russia didn't necessarily agree to it. It's, these guys are moving faster than what they were prior. They're taking more territory than what they were prior, and they're killing more Ukrainians even faster. I mean, I guess my point is, isn't Syria and what is taking place in Syria right now the exact reason why Russia would never accept any terms of a frozen conflict, even if Donald Trump comes in and tries to propose such.
Well, okay. So when you say frozen conflict, that's kind of a euphemism that American politicians use, but it's really just pointing to the reality of what William S. Lind, the Pentagon strategist, has referred to as fourth generation warfare. Look, we're in an era where if the USA and Russia directly went to war, humanity would end. There would be a nuclear exchange, and that would be the end of the world. If China and the United States directly went to war, nuclear exchange, the end of humanity. And really, since the end of the Second World War, since the rise of atomic weapons, but really, especially since the 1970s, more of a reality, it's become the fact that you can't have direct conflict between great powers. And so war is fought by proxies. It's fought with, states that are contested. And the main way that war is carried out is not by states and their official militaries, but it's by what they refer to as non-state actors, political movements, religious movements, etc. And they battle each other and they enter alliances with different states. And there's kind of a geopolitical chess game that is fought as different non-state actors are backed by different forces, and different states are backed by different forces. And there's kind of a geopolitical chess game because great powers can't directly fight one another. And so when you talk about a frozen conflict, that the idea of a frozen conflict, I guess the way they present it is the countries, there's still tension there between different forces, but they're not technically at war, but there's just kind of, there's things, kind of like Northern Ireland, there's a lot of Irish folks that want the 6 counties to return, but the conflict is technically not going on, but there's still tension there. I mean, that's just kind of a reality of geopolitics in our time, right? There's going to be tensions in various regions, and there's going to be groups that disagree with each other, and there's going to be different powers kind of, strategically backing those groups for their own reasons as they contend with each other, because the great powers can no longer directly clash with one another. So I think frozen conflicts are just kind of the reality of our era. Ultimately, I think if we were to move toward the dream of just kind of accepting multipolarity, if the United States and the NATO countries could just recognize that it's a new world, and that there's going to be other centers of power in the world. The world's just not going to be centered around the West as it once was. I think that could certainly de-escalate. But unless that kind of comes into existence, we're going to see what you might call frozen conflicts around the world. That's just going to be kind of a reality of what we deal with. And it's fourth generation warfare. It's the reality of how war is fought in our time.
I get that. I get the sense that Russia is willing to take all of Ukraine as opposed to allowing it to freeze. And that frozen conflict thing is exactly why. Like, I understand the tension thing. I mean, the reality of it is, though, my fear is that they sleepwalk into direct engagement, which honestly could really take place in Ukraine right now, especially if Donald Trump comes in with this kind of pressure campaign and not willing to accept the deal or the agreement that Putin puts on the table. And I want to move to Trump, because Donald Trump is over and over again saying, I want to have peace, not war. I want to stop wars, not start wars. I applauded Trump for going to North Korea. I thought it was fantastic. And he was attacked for it, which is astonishing. I mean, even on the campaign trail, they were attacking him for making deals or trying to make agreements with North Korea to bring down hostilities. And it worked. It was proof of concept that we didn't necessarily have to have belligerent foreign policy to every government. You were hosting or being a part of an organization that is trying to push Trump into doing this and to do it more. I want you to explain what that is, because I went through your article yesterday and I agreed with you that we do need to push Trump in a particular direction, even though Trump is somewhat of a wild card. And I don't necessarily know exactly where Donald Trump is going to go, but I do know between the two political parties, he's the one that is most open to making deals, if the deal can be reached. Give me your point in that, and tell the audience the date of that rally that is being held in relation to this. Please go into it for me.
Well, okay, so my organization, we're called the Center for Political Innovation. We've been around for a few years, and we facilitate discussion, etc. Our main way of intervening in the last month of the election cycle in October is we marched through the streets of New York City with an 8x12 banner That's pretty big, 8 by 12. And, you know, it gets windy in New York, so it's almost like a big sail. It's kind of heavy to carry around. But we had an 8 by 12 banner with Trump and Kim Jong-un shaking hands with the slogan, "Only peace can make America great again." We took that banner to Trump Tower. We took that banner to the New York Public Library. And then when Trump had his big rally at Madison Square Garden, we unfurled it there as well. And we were featured in New Yorker magazine. They quoted me and they talked about our banner in New Yorker magazine. We were just part of the political scenery in New York with our slogan, "Only peace can make America great again," pointing to the fact that when Donald Trump went to North Korea, that was a great step forward, right? It was, you know, a country, you could call it a frozen conflict, right? There's, you know, two governments on the Korean Peninsula that have been at odds with each other. The USA doesn't recognize or have diplomatic relations with North Korea, but yet Trump took the first move toward possibly bridging that divide. And, you know, we thought that was a great step forward. What I thought was interesting is that Trump bragged about that on the campaign trail many times. He said, "I went to North Korea, I met with Kim Jong-un, etc." And his own side told him to stop doing that. The Wall Street Journal criticized Trump, and they said, "Don't do that. Don't bring that up. It didn't go anyplace. It was not good." But he kept doing it. He's just like, Trump is proud that he went to North Korea, and he wants to do more things like that. And I think Donald Trump also realizes that his hope for making a deal and improving relations with North Korea was sabotaged by his own side. John Bolton and Mike Pompeo both went to North Korea with Trump, and John Bolton was pretty blatantly trying to sabotage it the whole time. Mike Pompeo, not as much openly, but Mike Pompeo has since betrayed Donald Trump around, you know, calling for him to be prosecuted, you know, for documents, etc. And that that Trump was kind of being sabotaged by his own side. And then you'll recall that during the process of those peace talks, individuals in Spain that were pretty widely reported in the Spanish press to be CIA individuals raided the North Korean embassy in Spain and attacked the North Korean embassy, stole a bunch of laptops, etc. And that was done just as a provocation, just to antagonize North Korea. And that a big section of the American deep state was saying, "We don't want peace with North Korea. We will not allow this to happen." And Trump was trying to have peace with North Korea. And Trump's, you know, ally and friend, Mike, what's his name? He's the investor from Singapore. Jim Rogers. Jim Rogers, the legendary investor, he was backing Trump in trading and trying to improve relations with North Korea. Jim Rogers, and there were a number of other forces that were supporting Trump in trying to make peace with North Korea, but the American intelligence apparatus and the deep state was trying to prevent it. And that the thing that I think is interesting, you can put this in the context of the new reports. You know, Anya Parampil put out the report saying that that apparently Trump and Maduro were going to meet during Trump's first term, and then Mike Pompeo sabotaged that, and that it seems like that within the Trump administration, there are different goals. And there is a very pragmatic pro-peace side to the Trump administration that wants to improve relations with different countries, that sees that as a way that America can become more prosperous because we're trading with different countries, etc. And there is the old neoconservative regime change apparatus and some special immigrant communities that have a bone to pick. That's important too. I mean, a big part of the Trump coalition is, you know, you have the Epoch Times, the Falun Gong. Those are folks that hate the Chinese government, and they just have a bone to pick against the Chinese government. You got the Miami Cubans. They hate the Cuban government. And that, so on the one hand, you've got these particular immigrant communities that have a real vendetta, and they're going to push Trump to, you know, be as provocative and regime change oriented in their particular country, in their particular region. But then you also have folks like Tulsi Gabbard and others that that just kind of want to, you know, improve U.S. relations and see that the strategy of regime change is not playing out in the interest of the United States in the long term. So there's different forces within the Trump administration. And I know a lot of people, I'm not thrilled about Marco Rubio being appointed. I think Marco Rubio is, you know, I mean, I can't think of somebody I disagree with more politically. But that said, I don't think people should just give up, right? If you just say, "Oh, look, he appointed Marco Rubio. Oh, it's all over," you're giving up. You're admitting defeat, because there's also Tulsi Gabbard. There's also Matt Gaetz, who was going to be Attorney General, and now he's going to be special counsel investigating the FBI. He just appointed an FBI director director, is somebody who's at odds with the FBI historically. So there's going to be struggle within the Trump administration, and that if we just kind of stand back and oppose it, we're not going to be part of the conflict. We're not going to be able to nudge things. We would like to nudge things in an anti-imperialist direction. But that requires, maneuvering and making alliances and trying to insert ideas and things like that, like we did with our Trump-Kim banner. I wrote my book about Kamala Harris that was banned from Amazon and then exploded in popularity and all of that. Again, you have to find openings and intervene. That's what being serious about politics is. Is that, when the American Civil War happened, right? We could have just sat back and said, oh, Lincoln is racist. He's just as bad as the South. But serious forces like Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and others said, look, Lincoln might have his flaws, but he is opposed to the slaveholders. And the slaveholders aren't going to accept him, even though he doesn't want to abolish slavery. He just wants to keep it from expanding. And that created an opening through which a lot of progressive forces could intervene. And ultimately, that led to the defeat of slavery, the Second American Revolution, right? And that the way change happens is not by just kind of sitting back and throwing your arms up and condemning. It's by seeing openings and divisions within the power structure, by using that to create movements and push forward your own unique message. And that's the way I see things. And that there's that old meme from The Simpsons. I don't know if you've ever seen old man yells at cloud, right? It's a meme from The Simpsons, right? And it's got, Grandpa Simpson and he's there, old man yells at cloud. In the age of social media, a lot of people think that's all they can be, right? Is that the world is just going to happen, but I can be on my Facebook or my Twitter complaining about it, right? And that, people will like my complaining, maybe share my complaining. I can complain in a unique way and all of that. Well, I'm here to challenge people and say, no, you can actually intervene in history. You can make a difference, but in order to do that, you have to be able to work with people you might disagree. You have to look for openings, et cetera, and all of that. We plan to attend the inauguration and to bring our Trump-Kim banner to the inauguration, along with a new banner about the peace bridge over the Bering Sea, because there have been plans for years to connect Alaska to Russia with a bridge. And I think Donald Trump could do it. I think Donald Trump could start the construction of the Bering Sea bridge connecting Alaska to Russia, and that would pivot our economy eastward away from NATO. It would get us in on the action of the, every year they have the Vladivostok Economic Forum in Russia, where, you can see there's so much economic development happening there with, the Eurasian Economic Union, and there's the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the Belt and Road, and that it could get us in on that action. So we're going to bring our Trump-Kim banner, Only Peace Can Make America Great Again. We're also bringing a new banner we'll be bringing with us, also huge, 8x12, about the peace bridge connecting Alaska to Russia. And then that evening, we're having a reception in Washington, D.C. To put forward, we need to figure out how we can engage with the new administration to push it in an anti-war direction in whatever way is possible.
Caleb, man, I appreciate this. Thank you for this. And I'm going to put the link at the bottom in the description of the event that you guys are having. Look, I think you're right. I said over the course of the election that Donald Trump should have been praised for when he was pushing for peace. That's a good thing. That's not necessarily a bad thing.
Let me ask you, Jamarl, you're in D.C., right?
Yeah.
Can you come to the event? Are you available that day?
Yes. Absolutely, yes. I am.
All right. I'll see you there.
I will be there. I'm going to put that in my calendar.
I'm looking forward, and I'll be looking forward to your remarks. I'm sure many people that are watching now will be very excited to meet you there. So there you go.
Absolutely. Caleb Maupin. He is a speaker, writer, journalist, political analyst, and author. In his book, Kamala Harris and the Future of America, an essay in 3 parts, he examines the life of Kamala Harris and puts it into context and the prominence of the context of the changing U.S. political discourse and the geopolitical stage. You can follow Caleb on Twitter at Caleb Maupin and read his articles at calebmaupin.com. Check him out. Every time the man opens his mouth, he says amazing things. Thank you, Caleb. I really appreciate it.
And thank you.
All right, let's go to our next guest, the one and only Elijah Magier. I am deeply appreciative of Elijah joining us. Elijah is a veteran war correspondent with 35 years of experience in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Sudan, Afghanistan, and Yugoslavia. Elijah, we're going to have to update that to like 37. That is very old. How you doing, man? You doing okay today?
I'm fine, thank you. Hello, Jamal.
Thank you for joining me. I have to start off, I guess, with the first question. Who are these people that are being paid in order to invade Syria in this way? I mean, clearly they're not doing it on their own devices. They've been receiving training, they've received money, etc. Who is pushing this? Who is edging this attack on Syria forward?
Syria is a very complicated war, and it's not easy to understand or explain for the majority of the people. Therefore, I'm going to try to be as clear as possible in the limited time we have. First of all, Syria is divided between the Americans in the northeast, the Turks in the northwest, and then the rest of the country is for the Syrian government. And since 2011, when the war started, there was an attempt to create a failed state in Syria. And this attempt has failed because the Syrian called the Iranian for help, who came to help Syria in 2013, and then they called the Russian in 2015. The Russian and the Americans wanted to make a deal and stop the war according to some demarcation lines. And John Kerry at that time was a Secretary of State and accepted the deal, but the Pentagon refused, and then the war continued. The Americans came, removed what remained of ISIS in the northeast, and then occupied their part. Turkey came, kicked out the Kurds in Afrin, and then took the rest of the northeast until the rural area of Idlib and the limit of Aleppo, and this is where it stayed. And then there was something called the Astana meeting and the Astana agreement, and there were so many meetings in an attempt to try and perhaps change the Syrian constitution, and then make room for all the refugees to return, and then for the government to embrace those in the northeast and in the northwest. Nevertheless, it is not a Russian Iranian decision, neither it is for the Syrian government to decide, because the Americans said they would pull out at the time of Donald Trump when he was president, and then he was not allowed to leave. And then Pentagon lied to President Trump, and they said there are only 300 men where there were more than 1,000. And then they have established military bases, military airports, and a stronghold controlling the oil and gas. And also the part of East Syria is known for not only its energy, but it's a food basket of Syria. Turkey said, I'm not going to leave as long as the Kurds, that are considered the PKK Syrian branch, that is an organization on the world terrorist list, but they act as a US proxies, and Turkey is suffering from their attacks. So this is where we were at, and all the Astana agreement did not work until 2019, when the government of Syria decided to make a serious military push to reopen the main road between Aleppo and Latakia and Aleppo in Damascus. They are called the M4 and M5 because Turkey did not manage to convince, or it did not feel that it was right to put pressure and open these roads, and was neglecting it, so these roads were opened by force. And the situation remained static until this month, 2024, but there's, in the last 48, 72 hours, there was a change of situation. And that is based on so many elements. It cannot be taken one on its own. So it is not the war between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon, or the war on Gaza, and the Israelis wanting to weaken the axis of the resistance. There is an element of that. But it's also the will of President Assad not to negotiate the return of refugees and the change of the constitution for a simple reason. Syria is under heavy Western sanctions. Nobody can deal with Syria and supply Syria with goods or lift the sanctions on Syria. Therefore, the government said, how can I take 4.5 million refugees in Turkey, 1.5 in Lebanon, more than 1 to 2 million in Jordan, when there are sanctions on the countries? How can I feed these people when the West is paying for Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey to keep the refugees? And then these refugees can return according to an agreement when the sanctions are lifted on Syria and the West is supporting Syria, because Syria was destroyed because of the Western war on this country. So this is not happening. And then Turkey is in a dilemma because it has more than 4 million refugees. President Erdogan has lost the municipality election, his party, in Istanbul. And then there is a mounting disagreement and anger from the Turkish people against the Syrian refugees, saying they are exhausting the resources of the country, they are taking jobs for cheap. The same in Lebanon is happening. And the Turks wants to get rid of the Syrian refugees. But President Erdogan cannot ask them to return to Syria because they are several millions. So where do they go? In Idlib, they will be packed like a box of sardines. So we have also the other element, that is Russia is engaged in a war in Ukraine. And because of that, there is little attention to Syria and its needs. And another element is Russia is not doing what it should do with Israel to stop its attack on Syria. By allowing the Israelis to attack Syria, Israel was attacking also the position of the Iranian, of Hezbollah, on all the allies of Syria that were keeping the line of defense for the Syrian army in opposite all the other groups that are in Idlib. And when these were destroyed or suffered heavy casualties, and then the Iranians did not rebuild them, because no war can start without a political will and a decision and a financial one. So you need the political decision and the money to finance a war. So this is where we see Turkey moving in and allowing all these groups that are in Idlib to not only arm themselves, because they are armed, but they have been trained like a classical army. They advanced like a classical army. They are supported with drones. They have intelligence information. They had dormant cell inside Aleppo that made me remember what happened in Mosul in 2014, in June 2014, when all the different Iraqi groups took control of Mosul and the whole Iraqi army left and withdrew without any plan. And this is what happened in Aleppo. The groups that came out of Idlib, different groups. We have the Syrian opposition, we have jihadists, we have former Al-Qaeda group, but they're not Al-Qaeda. Now, even if they maintain the same ideology, they have the same behavior, but they're not part of Al-Qaeda as an organization. They have other organizational groups and other titles they work under. And we have many pro-Turkish groups, jihadists. You have Uzbek, we have different Asian nationalities, Turkmenistan, the Chinese, Uyghur.
Yeah, the Uyghurs.
Sorry?
Uyghurs was one of the groups.
Yes.
It was Turkmenistan or something to that effect, but basically the Uyghurs were there also.
Yes.
Just, yeah, I'm
Yes.
sorry.
So all these groups participated in the attack, and the Syrian army left disorganized, but left the city without a defense. And I think by today, the whole city of Idlib and the rural area, because when the city falls, the whole area around it fall.
Mhm.
And this is what happened in the last 3 days. So there is a will to see this happening, but also a will to give this control for Turkey, because we've seen areas under the control of the Kurds in Sheikh Maqsoud, in Tel Rifat, forced to be displaced toward northeast Syria and leave their belonging behind, and leaving the whole area only to the pro-Turkish groups. And this is where we are at today.
Okay, I guess that leads to two questions. One has to do with how could this happen? I mean, the Russian forces were in Syria. The Syrian forces had to be aware that terrorists were arming in preparation for an attack. I mean, this stuff was talked about even on Telegram. What happened? How did this fail to such a degree? And I want to move to Turkey for a bit because Turkey was being bribed by Europe to keep those 4 million Syrians from going into Europe, because so many Syrians had basically moved into Europe as a result of the wars. But I want to go to the first one first. How did that happen? How on earth did they get caught this unaware?
Well, that's a big question, because the decision of going to war must be a political decision. Turkey met on the Astana 22 on the 11th to 12th of November last month, just a couple of weeks ago, and they did not look like planning to invade Aleppo with their proxy groups and support an attack. So neither Iran nor Russia understood what was the plan. Nevertheless, for the last 3 months, the groups in Idlib were advertising their will to prepare and mount the attack. Nevertheless, nobody seems in Damascus kept an eye on these people or took them seriously, and everybody was busy in their war, the Russian in Ukraine. This is why Russia removed the general responsible for Syria and was replaced. And then Iran was busy because it is under attack by Israel, and with the support of NATO, and all its allies in Gaza and in Lebanon are under heavy attack, and its own position for the advisors are attacked in Syria. So due to the situation, this is why I say you can't take only one element, say this is the reason. No, it's a combination of different elements that speed up the attack, mixed with the decision of President Assad rejecting the meeting with President Erdogan, who wanted to talk to President Assad about a solution where they can start the negotiation regarding Idlib and its surrounding. President Assad had a position saying, I'm not going to meet for a photograph where I give you my blessing because of what you have done in Syria, and you still occupy part of Syria. I need to sign an agreement where you are going to commit to withdraw from Syria. They were meeting by the intelligence services, the head of the intelligence services of both sides, of both countries, Syria and Iraq and Turkey. They met several times, but they did not reach an agreement. And this is where President Assad also played this role, like President Erdogan played a role to sanction the attack. So this is why I said it's complicated, because not one reason that triggered the war. But to add to all that, the will of the US to see Syria divided since 2011, to keep the status quo, to weaken Syria, to make sure that the advance of the opposition and the jihadists may be an opportunity to surprise all the other groups that are pro-Syrian government groups and the Syrian government, and push in a way that they can occupy Hama, for example, try to block the road of weapon supply to Hezbollah in Lebanon, and then this is where Hezbollah can be squeezed without a line of support for its weapons from Iran. So having Syria weak is also in the advantage of Israel. And for someone to put all these points together and understand the ramification of each is not that easy.
No, I totally understand that. That is why I wanted you on, because it's complicated. Like, you have all of these groups that are basically vying for a certain amount of control, whether it's the US, whether it's Israel supporting terrorist groups, which would seem antithetical, but it's not. Like, it's fascinating, to put it mildly. One other question on this. I am Europe, is this a misstep? And the reason why I ask, is this a misstep? Does this provide an opportunity for Syria to finally take Idlib? Meaning for the Russian contingent to come back into Syria in order to assist. Apparently, they've dispatched one of their groups into Syria itself. There's even talk. I guess my point is, Idlib was being held by like 20, 30,000 terrorists, according to the United Nations itself. This is going back to 2011. And for the most part, the US was protecting Idlib, basically being their air force, which is astonishing. You have John Sullivan sending a message to Hillary Clinton saying Al-Qaeda is on our side. Basically, we're backing them. They're our group in that area. Is there a chance with this, I guess, reignition of the war to take back Idlib, to finally reunify Syria? Or is that not on the table right now?
Well, to start with the end of your question, this is not going to happen because we're talking about vast lands. So the jihadists and the opposition group took control of 7,500 square kilometers. So that is 3/4 of Lebanon in 3-4 days. Reconquering the area as attacking forces, they need to be at least 3 times more than the defenders. That's one. Two, when they fight in urban areas, they need to be 5 to 8 times more. So retaking all this area is going to be extremely difficult for the time being, to take village by village, because there are dozens of villages in between Aleppo and Hama. And the opposition group and the jihadists today are at the limit of Hama province. And Hama province is even bigger. It is around 8,800 square kilometers. And
wait,
it is,
Elijah, I'm sorry. There was a miscommunication. What I mean is it possible for the Syrian government, working with the Russians, to take back all of the territory and Idlib, meaning to destroy Idlib as a terrorist haven? Is this an opportunity for the government to do that?
Yeah, but I'm talking about impossibility to retake what they have lost in the 3 days.
Oh, I see.
So
I'm sorry.
We can think in going back and taking Idlib even. So it's just taking back Aleppo is going to be extremely painful for the Syrian government and all its allies, and going to cost a lot of, a large number of losses, of human losses, and effective. This is why I'm saying reconquering what was lost is going to be a very difficult mission and going to require a long time to do so. So we can't think of taking back Idlib even, because Idlib is governed by an understanding with Turkey and the United States, because Turkey is saying, well, I cannot leave, and this is where I come to your first part, the third part of your question. Now, the United States forces that occupy northeast Syria are protected by the YPG, and they are the PKK Syrian branch that are on the international list of terrorism by the United States and Europe. And yet they are the one protecting the US forces. They are the main American allies. They have strong lobbies in America, in the Congress, and they are protected by the US. And they are the one protecting the US forces. So you can imagine you have around 100 to 150,000 Kurdish troops in northeast Syria protecting a few hundred American soldiers. So how it is possible to go and take back northeast Syria and northwest Syria? It's a kind of an impossible mission. And then there are many areas between Idlib and Hama or Aleppo. If we talk about the areas like Sarakib and all the villages in between, they empty areas because the government doesn't have the money to reconstruct. The people there fled their homes and they are refugees. There are more or less 8 million refugees abroad, Syrian refugees. So, and they are considered as a weight on the Syrian government that is under heavy sanctions. Because even if the first and easiest way to remove President Assad is to allow these 8 million refugees to return home, because he can't look after them. There are sanctions, maintaining sanctions and allowing to return home. But what the West is doing is keeping these people abroad, putting pressure on the government that are hosting the refugees, and then making sure that they do not return, so they can accuse President Assad of lacking legitimacy, as there are many million Syrians abroad. And they're paying money for these Syrians. Not only the government, they're paying for the Syrians to stay abroad. And these people are paid better than if they return home. So all these facilities that is offered by the West is to make sure that Syria is not a legitimate, ruled by a legitimate leader, because Syria represents a danger to Israel. The Americans have no interest in Syria. No American can claim an interest for its national security. But yes, there's a large interest for the national security of Israel to keep Syria unstable, because Syria has even returned to the Arab League. And the Arabs now have established good relationship with Syria, apart from Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, Bahrain, Egypt, Oman. All these countries have now good relationship with Syria, good ties. They working with President Assad. He's participating to the meeting with the Arab League and Arab Summit. So he is no longer isolated. There are European delegations. The head of the Italian intelligence services visited Syria. The head of the German intelligence services visited Syria. There are French delegation, from a parliamentary delegation who are visiting Syria. There are even US officials who visited Syria. And suddenly we see this attack happening on Aleppo to even make sure that Syria is more divided than ever. And all the Syrian allies are busy in recovering what Syria has lost, rather than rebuilding the strength of the axis of the resistance like Hezbollah and Iran, to rearm itself in preparation to the arrival of President Trump to power and what President Trump is planning for Iran.
Let me ask you this. I have about 30 seconds. Europe is fascinating me. When I visited Europe doesn't seem to make the connection between the wars that's taking place in Syria that the US is involved in and the refugees that end up in Europe. I mean, if you go to like Germany, or for that matter, Austria, you would see a massive amount of Syrians in those countries that came in during the wars. So is this going to be another influx of refugees into Europe? Or for that matter, is Erdogan going to be able to blackmail Europe once again in order to keep the refugees in Turkey? We have about 30 seconds or maybe a minute. Give me your take on that.
The minority in Idlib and the whole area that is today under the control of the jihadists and the opposition have fled the area because there is no place for the Christians and the Kurds and other minority in different religions, the Shia and the Alawi for certain. Now, yes, they do represent a burden on Europe, but Europe doesn't have a say when it is a US vessel. So if in Europe the decision is to the US, regardless the burden and the consequences on our economy, look what we have done in Ukraine. We went completely in the opposite direction of the interest of Europe because the European leaders are just executing America first and what America wants. And this is why it is not a question of the damage that Europe is going to suffer, but what the Americans want from Europe, and Europe will just execute, regardless the increase of refugees or the increase of money to the refugee, that they will leave Syria to a safer place.
Elijah, man, thank you for this. Always appreciate when you join me. Elijah Magier, he's a veteran war correspondent with 35 years of experience in Iran, Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Libya, Sudan, Afghanistan, and Yugoslavia. Like I said, I'm going to have to update that to like 37. Thank you for this, Elijah.
Thank you, Jamal. All the best.
All right, let's go to our next guest. We are joined with Robert Patina. He is an author, journalist, and activist working for peace and social justice. He is the author of the new book, Settler Colonialism in Palestine and Kashmir. You are the person to talk to this morning. How you doing, Robert? You doing all right?
I'm doing very well. Thank you. Thank you for having me on.
No, man, thank you for joining me. The reason I brought you on, there is a ceasefire that is taking place. And this ceasefire, it's weird to even say, but the Israeli military has been slaughtering, meaning the IDF has been slaughtering Lebanese and Palestinians indiscriminately. But I don't want to focus on Lebanon for the moment. We get this notice, we have a ceasefire. Okay. And in that ceasefire, there's going to be about 60 days, and in which time a transition would take place where the Lebanese military will occupy southern Lebanon, working, I suppose, with NATO or UN forces. All right. But then when you look at the deal was made by Amos Hochstein, who was a former IDF soldier and a dual citizen that Joe Biden sent to Lebanon to negotiate as envoy to the United States. So he sends a former IDF soldier, the same IDF that has been slaughtering the Lebanese left and right indiscriminately, to negotiate a deal on behalf of the United States. That's outrageous. If anything, he's going to negotiate the deal that's best for its best interest of Israel. And when you look at it, I have had reports from people on the ground saying the Israeli military is issuing a curfew, or the Israeli military is shooting at people who are trying to return to their homes. And there was another story that recently came out of Israel bombing after the ceasefire. And you look at that, you're like, okay, what kind of ceasefire is this that allows the power, or one of the powers that invaded, to set curfews, to still fire at people who are supposed to be able to go to their homes, and for that matter, still commit bombing in that country? Give me your take on this. Like, what kind of ceasefire deal is this that allows this?
Well, anything that's brokered by the United States will be unfair, especially if it involves Israel. But any deal, a ceasefire deal that the United States has a hand in, is going to be slanted toward one party or the other. And when it's Israel, it will always be slanted toward Israel. Now, France has accused Israel of at least 52 violations. This was as of yesterday. Israel has bombed a church where it said, quote, known terrorists, unquote, were hiding. Now, terrorists are always defined by the United States and Israel. it could be men, women, and children. It doesn't matter to them. If Israel wants to bomb them, they're called terrorists. So the fact that Biden has sent, as you said, a former IDF soldier to Lebanon, this person cannot be impartial. This person cannot be fair. This person obviously has an agenda, and he activated that agenda in this so-called ceasefire agreement. And Israel has said now that the ceasefire, such as it is in effect in Lebanon, it can focus on its genocide in Gaza. So this has not been anything that's going to bring peace and stability to the Middle East.
Well, one of the main reasons that Netanyahu even admitted that A, they wanted to focus on Iran, B, they needed to rearm, because you had so many people who either wasn't showing up to the IDF or losses. I mean, they don't necessarily talk about it because Israel doesn't publish their numbers, but the number of Israelis who were killed in those raids, especially fighting in southern Lebanon, where they ran into a buzzsaw with Hezbollah fighters on the ground, or the people who are losing their minds, like the people who are committing suicides or the people who are having mental breakdowns because of the things that they were doing, either in Gaza or the kind of back and forth fighting that they kept. You know, it's like they clear an area, leave, and then have to come back to the same area, leave, come back to the same area, how it was weighing on the consciousness of the people who were in the military. And so from Netanyahu's point of view, well, okay, well, we can rearm, we can reload, and as you pointed out, we can isolate Gaza, which was one of the main points that Hezbollah was involved in fighting, basically saying we're launching these missiles because you're committing a genocide. You need to stop this genocide. Well, they didn't want to stop the genocide, and this deal allows them to do that. I guess my question is, if Israel violates the ceasefire, are we really expecting the U.S. to do anything about it? Netanyahu has come out and said, well, this deal is not me stopping the war. If there's anything that Hezbollah does, we will attack. Now, that is not what the ceasefire says, but in all honesty, do we really doubt that the U.S. would get involved if Israel does that? And I guess that's why I go with the ceasefire thing. It doesn't seem like a ceasefire in a real sense. It seems like a paper ceasefire that allows Israel to function as they will, regardless of what effectively is happening on the ground. Give me a take on that.
Yeah, it's political theater. Biden can say, oh, we brokered a ceasefire and stopped the fighting in Lebanon. Now, one of the terms of ceasefire include the fact that each side, Israel and Lebanon, can protect their sovereignty. Now, anything that anytime Israel bombs Lebanon during the quote ceasefire period, Israel will say they were just protecting their own nation, they're protecting Israeli sovereignty, and the United States will agree with that. So the United States will make no effort to rein in Israeli terrorism because that's not in the geopolitical goals of the United States. So while France has, as I mentioned, identified many Israeli violations, nothing's being done about that. The United States, as one of the enforcers, is going to just ignore it. It's not going to do anything to hold back or to restrain Israel in any way, as we've seen in Gaza, where the U.S. government spokespeople are saying that they are working tirelessly for a ceasefire, and yet they're supplying all the weapons for the genocide. So we're going to see the same unfairness as we continue to in Lebanon as far as the United States is concerned.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. I have my producer, Laith, was Lebanese in heritage. He had family in Syria and Lebanon. I've had Laith Maruth on the show, who, as he was doing the show, could hear drones like hovering overhead. Like some of the stuff is just really hard to kind of get your head around. Why did Hezbollah agree to the ceasefire? I mean, they had to know that all things being equal, this stuff wasn't being negotiated with clean hands. Was it because regardless of the fact that I would say they were able to prevent Israel from taking southern Lebanon, they suffered a heavy toll in doing so, not to mention Israel was blackmailing them with this kind of indiscriminate bombing that was taking place. Is that why they accepted the deal, that effectively Israel was able to damage the organization sufficiently where they themselves had to take a break, or at the very least come to a ceasefire for their own, or for that matter, even the population's best interests?
Yeah, I think that there are two questions there. One is why Lebanon agreed, and the other is why Israel agreed. So let's talk about Lebanon first. Lebanon's military capacity was damaged greatly by Israel immediately at the beginning of
Real quick, is it Lebanon's military capacity or Hezbollah's military capacity?
Military capacity was damaged, and they needed to, as you said, take a break. They need to regroup. Now, part of the ceasefire agreement says they won't regroup, that they won't have any weapons, they'll give up their weapons and so on. This isn't going to happen, obviously. Hezbollah is very popular in Lebanon because Hezbollah is seen as an organization that is doing something to help the country. The other question, though, that I'll raise, I'll ask and answer, is why Israel agreed to it. Because as you mentioned, Israel was taking losses that it did not anticipate. Now, we don't know how many soldiers. Israel has said 70-some soldiers were killed. It's probably a much higher number than that. But within Israel, soldiers are gods. They're revered, and killing a soldier is just a horrible thing for the Israeli population. And the losses they were sustaining were just beyond what they could cope with. Also, tens of thousands of Israelis had to leave their homes, and this was causing problems for the government. People wanted to go back to their homes, as anyone would. So Israel was forced, because of its losses and because of internal pressures, to agree to some kind of a ceasefire, even though it is weighted far in favor of Israel, which Israel expected because the United States was involved. But Lebanon, Hezbollah, needed to take some time for their regrouping. A lot of their leaders had been killed during the disgraceful terrorist activity of the exploding pagers. But what the United States and Israel, and I've said this before, what they do not accept and can't understand is that the resistance is not going to end by killing members of the resistance. For everyone they kill, 10 more resistance fighters join, simply because they are protecting their country, the resistance fighters, and they're protecting their allies. They're working for the people of Lebanon, also the people of Palestine and Syria and Iran. This is it's a feeling of pride in their country and in their similar countries around them that have similar cultures and that are oppressed by similar settler colonial attitudes.
I'm glad you brought in colonial attitudes, because I often point to Israel as a settler colonial state, and that, settler colonial states tend to expand. They tend to have to kill the local population, or at the very least expel the local population, in order to expand into the various territories. And whether that's with Gaza, whether that's with the West Bank, whether that's with southern Lebanon, whether that's with Syria, that has been true. There has been a plan put out to annex the West Bank. Seymour Hersh wrote about this, but at this point, the Israeli government itself has came out and owned up with it themselves, saying that's what they're going to do. This came out during the Trump election, but if I'm being honest, this could have came out during the Biden administration, and I have a hard time believing Joe Biden would have done or said anything about them doing so. I mean, what are they going to do with the local population in the West Bank if they annex the West Bank? That has to be the question. If you talk to an Israeli and you say, well, what if you just allow everybody that's in Gaza and everybody in the West Bank to be part of Israel? And they say, well, that's not Israel anymore. Okay, fair enough. Well, they're about to take and steal the entirety of the West Bank. So what is the expectation for the people who are living in the West Bank when they take the West Bank, if indeed they're going to go through with this plan?
Those Palestinians who remain in the West Bank will be second-class citizens. They will be subject to different laws, different rules. They will be oppressed and harassed and killed on a regular basis with no redress with the government. They will have no one to turn to, since the international community has abandoned them thus far and will continue to abandon them. It will be continued apartheid on steroids, because there's no place for the people to go. You'll have no opportunity in Israel. I will also mention that annexation is absolutely a violation of international law. It can't be recognized internationally. The U.S. government under Trump recognized Israeli annexation of the Golan Heights, but the rest of the world community didn't. But the fact that if West Bank is annexed and the world community doesn't recognize it, it doesn't change anything on the ground for the Palestinians there. They're still going to be second-class citizens, continually oppressed, with fewer rights, fewer opportunities, and just a terrible life. And that's what the outcome is going to be.
That is astonishing. Like, it's hard to get my head around the conditions that they are living in. And it's even worse when I realize that my government is effectively paying for it. How do you envision this? Well, let me ask it this way. Donald Trump plans to come in, and he's, just like Joe Biden, going to give Israel everything that he wants. It seems that he's going to do a pressure campaign on Iran. But the catch is, all of those governments at this point it's a different world than when Donald Trump left. I mean, when Donald Trump left, he was able to get Saudi Arabia, he was able to get the Abraham Accords, all of these groups. Saudi Arabia was against Iran at that point. That is not really the world that we're in. Those states are very angry at what Israel has been doing. At the very least, the populations of those states are very angry at what the population has been doing. How do you see this ending? Might necessarily not be the right word for it, but how do you see this unfolding on the ground when hostilities finally come to a head? Meaning when hostilities finally end. How do you think this is going to look, either in Gaza, either in the West Bank? What does this look like going forward?
Well, as you said, it is a different world than the one Trump left. When he left, Saudi Arabia and Iran had no diplomatic associations. That an agreement was brokered a couple of years ago with China between those two, and they have reestablished diplomatic relations. So that's a big change. Also, China's influence in the Middle East has increased, and that's evidenced by that agreement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Also, Palestine is now on the forefront of the world's mind. People around the world who ignored it before are horrified and appalled by what's been happening in the last 14 months, and they want it to stop, even if their governments are not listening yet. So if Trump decides that he's going to accept the annexation of the West Bank and probably the Gaza Strip, then there's going to be tremendous opposition around the world. Also, the resistance in Lebanon, Syria, Yemen, Iran, and Iraq is going to be much stronger, because they're not going to sit back and watch another Arab nation be completely absorbed into Israel and see the millions of people who live in Palestine further oppressed, even worse than they have been. So it's going to be a difficult situation, and there's not going to be security for Israel, certainly. And the Middle East is a powder keg, and Trump's election lights the fuse.
From your point of view, it's hard to figure out. Some of the people that I've had on, they've made the argument that, Palestine needs to be able to decide what it wants to be in and of itself. It's not necessarily for external powers to make that choice. And as you pointed out, there are various resistance groups, whether it's Hezbollah, whether it's Hamas, etc., that are pushing back against this kind of colonial state of Israel. And, what the Palestinian who is not necessarily part of Hamas, what are they, and you might not necessarily be able to know this, but what is the prevailing political thought there? Do they back Hamas? I know you said the majority of Lebanese back Hezbollah because, again, if you're being attacked, the thing that's defending you in that attack is going to be the thing on some level you back, even if you don't necessarily back them entirely politically. You at the very least understand that they are the ones who are fighting against the military that's invading your country. But from the Palestinians, what is their thoughts? What is their point of view on well, I would imagine it's misery in one sense, but in a political sense, what's the thinking?
It's difficult politically to pin down what they're thinking, because right now they're just trying to survive, especially in Gaza. I'm in contact with people in Gaza. The conditions there are beyond what I can even imagine. But Hamas was is a political party in ideology, and it's one that seeks the Palestinian voice and seeks freedom from the colonial rule of Israel. So the people in Palestine want that. They want the country that was stolen from them in 1948. They want back, even if it's not. Israel exists. It's a fact of life, but the pre-1967 borders need to be respected. Israel needs to pull back, remove the settlers, something like 800,000 of them now. The people in Palestine want to have a nation where they can work, where they can travel, where they can trade with other countries, where they can live their lives the same way anyone else does. Their sympathy for Hamas right now is that Hamas has brought their plight to the world stage, but at the same time, it has caused just untold suffering for them because of the resistance from October 7th, which was, we have to remember that an occupied people has the international right to resist the occupation in any way at its disposal, including armed struggle. So that happened on October 7th, and the response has been genocide. So they're suffering horribly. But what they're looking for is to be able to voice their opinion. A few years ago, Palestinian elections were held, which Mahmoud Abbas canceled a few days before. People want to have a voice in their government. It was totally unjust and unfair for him to cancel them. But they're looking for...
Real quick, I'm glad you mentioned Abbas, because I've seen him in various instances recently in a way that I haven't necessarily seen him over the course of the last several years. What is it with him? You mentioned that he canceled the election. He canceled the election because he knew he was going to lose that election. And he's, on some level, has been working with the Israeli government. He has been hated, correct me if I'm wrong, in Palestinian circles because they look at him as being a turncoat, as a traitor. Am I wrong on that?
He is a traitor. He is a traitor, and the people recognize that. One of the tools that an occupied people has to resist the occupation is resistance, making it as difficult for the occupier as possible to occupy the land. Now, with the so-called security cooperation coordination that Abbas has with Israel and has had for years, that removes from the Palestinian people that ability to resist, because Abbas is telling Israel where there's going to be resistance, is having Palestinian soldiers arrest Palestinians, working with in coordination with Israel. So yes, he is hated. Yes, there needs to be elections so that he can be removed. When he cancels the elections, it was expected he would get about 19% of the vote, which is pretty dismal. So yeah, he's a traitor. He needs to be removed. He is a barrier to Palestinian freedom.
From your point of view, how does this, if this gets resolved, how does this look in the end? I mean, they always bring up the two-state solution, but the two-state solution feels like a dog and pony show. I mean, at this point, like you said, Israel is a fact of life. And I cannot see this government or any Israeli government. I mean, many of the people who are on the ground are fascists. They back what Netanyahu is doing, even if they don't necessarily like him personally. I mean, is this a one-state solution? Is there something more creative that we haven't necessarily thought of? Give me a thought on it. I guess that's one question, but also to piggyback that question, is Israel safer today than it was on October 6th?
Okay, it's the second question first. No, Israel is not safe, and Israeli people know it. They know that the hatred for the government, this isn't anti-Semitism, this is hatred of oppression, of colonialism, and of genocide, has increased greatly because of Israeli actions. So the Israeli people know they can't sleep peacefully at night because they don't know what Iran is going to do, what Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, what they're going to do in opposition to this oppression. Now, as far as a solution, a one-state solution will never fly with the Israeli government because they pride themselves. They passed a law a few years ago that declared themselves a Jewish state, a state for the Jewish people and only the Jewish people. So if a large population of non-Jewish people become part of what's now Israel, if that whole area, Israel and Palestine, became one country, then Israel would no longer be a Jewish state. It would be a democratic state, which it isn't now, but it would no longer be a Jewish state. And Netanyahu and the current government, and no one who is a possible future government leader, would ever agree to that. So what it has to be is international law has to be followed. International is very clear. This isn't a case of religious conflict or anything else. It's a case of international law. International law says that the borders of Israel and Palestine were what was established in 1948. That was unjust because Palestine was carved out, a large portion of it was carved out to create another country within its borders. But that's a fact of life. And the pre-1967 borders, the borders that were established in 1948, are those that must be respected. This would mean an end of the occupation, an removal of the Israeli settlers, and both countries being able to live in peace side by side. We are light years away from that at this point.
Yeah, it is deeply unfortunate what is taking place on the ground there. It is astonishing, to put it mildly. Robert, man, thank you for this. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
I've just been shocked. I mean, like, they call it a ceasefire, but it doesn't necessarily look like a ceasefire in real terms. And it feels like whatever Israel does in this context that breaks or violates the ceasefire, the U.S. is going to take a very similar position as it did through the entire war. Like when Hamas was agreeing to a deal, and it was clear that Netanyahu was the one who was not agreeing to a deal, you would send out, that sociopath Matt Miller saying, well, no, Hamas is not accepting a deal. or they would say, why is Israel not going to accept their own deal? Because they were putting it out as it was Israel's deal. It was very bizarre, and they kept doing it over and over and over again. And so I have a hard time believing that the government that's willing to do this is going to somehow enforce a ceasefire agreement. I don't see it. I don't see it at all. Man, Robert, thank you for this. I really appreciate it. Robert Patina, he is author, journalist, and activist working for peace and social justice. He is also author of the new book, Settler Colonialism in Palestine and Kashmir. Check him out. Thank you for this, Robert. I appreciate it. All right. We are going to get a good treat that is going to come up at 9 o'clock. Steve Gill and Ted Rawl are going to be here on the show. They are going to clash swords on events and things that are taking place in a domestic sense. Interestingly enough, the Harris campaign does not necessarily accept their failures or their foibles in this case. They have pointed to everything. It's been the kitchen sink. It was hot that day. It was snowing in some places. It was raining. I caught the cold. My dog ate my homework. It is everything except we fundamentally failed on a massive effing level and spent $1.5 billion in that failure. It looks like a grift. That's what it looks like. So there's that. The other thing is Joe Biden pardoning his young boy. Joe Biden pardons Hunter Biden. And he pardons him for 10 years of activities. Think about that. 10 years of criminality, of drug use, of prostitution, of tax evasion. 10 years. And Joe Biden makes this argument that, look, this is unfair. This is unjust. I love my boy. And, so he was a drug addict. And I think they treated him poorly as a drug addict. And because I think they treated him poorly as a drug addict, I am going to pass, I'm going to give him a pardon for 10 years of criminality. That is astonishing. And part of the reason I call it astonishing is because Joe Biden over and over again said, I'm not going to pardon my kid. I'm not going to pardon my kid. I believe in the justice system. Donald Trump doesn't believe in the justice system. So I, Joe Biden, will abide by the law and trust in the justice system. And under no circumstances will I pardon my kid? In fact, right here, it's this clip that I was looking for to pull up. Joe Biden telling the world, I will not pardon my kid.
Question regarding the family. I'm extremely proud of my son, Hunter. He has overcome an addiction. He's one of the brightest, most decent men I know. And I am satisfied that I'm not going to do anything. I said I abide by the jury decision. I will do that, and I will not pardon him.
I will abide by the jury decision, and I will not pardon him. Well, that didn't last long. That didn't last long. Joe Biden came out and pardoned his kid. So there is that. I want to bring in my guests. We are joined with Ted Rall. Ted Rall is a political cartoonist, syndicated columnist, and a great friend of the show. Ted, man, welcome to the show, man. How you doing this morning?
I'm doing good. I one of the reasons I don't kill myself every morning is because I always want to be surprised. You don't know what you would miss if you were dead. And my level of cynicism about politics, I always think it's hit rock bottom. I'm like, no. There's a sub basement underneath there. There's a cellar. There's a storm sewer beneath that. And then there's a fallout shelter from the 1950s down below there. Then there's a couple of old abandoned subways under there. And I think we've now hit like Cold War era Terminator 3 kind of like deep inside the bunker of insanity. The level of cynicism is truly breathtaking and wildly entertaining.
Ted, I agree with you. I think somebody else that may agree with both of you is Steve Gill. I want to bring him in too. Steve Gill.
Hey, Steve.
Good morning, guys.
Steve Gill is an attorney and CEO of Gill Media, a Nashville, Tennessee-based public affairs media marketing company. He also served as Director of Intergovernmental Affairs for the U.S. Trade Representative. Steve, I was just talking about the pardon for Hunter Biden, and that is after Joe Biden said he will not pardon his kid. And what's wild about this too, first thing I thought of when this pardon came up was, well, Joe Biden was in Congress screaming at people who are on crack, saying, I don't care what their upbringing was. I don't care what they went through. Throw them in prison. In fact, I think I have that clip. In fact, I do have that clip. So this is Joe Biden in Congress saying he doesn't necessarily care about the situation people are going through. Throw them in jail. Hang them high. Joe Biden. At least I thought we had that clip. Give me 1 second. Let me pull that up. It's telling me that it failed all of a sudden. Right here. Joe Biden, hang him high.
If you have a piece of crack cocaine no bigger than this quarter that I'm holding in my hand, 1/4 of $1, we passed a law through the leadership of Senator Thurmond and myself and others, a law that says you're caught with that, you go to jail for 5 years. You get no probation. You get nothing other than 5 years in jail. Judge doesn't have a choice. If you have.
Well, that's what he said, for his kid. If he was fine with throwing other people's kids in jail for extended periods of time for crack cocaine. And to be fair to Hunter Biden, they didn't get him on that. They got him on a gun charge, which ended up being felonies, and they got him on the tax charges. I think it was 3 felonies and 6 misdemeanors that he pleaded guilty to. Steve, let me start with you on this one. Give me your take on this. I mean, I understand. I get it. And I even predicted that Joe Biden was going to do this. But by the same token, it's still trashy. Hunter Biden has been involved in criminality going back for God knows how long. whether it was the crack, whether it was the prostitutes, whether it was the stuff that was in the laptop in regards to the financial deals, whether it was Farrah charges. Joe Biden has given him a blanket pardon for 10 years of criminality. That is pretty astonishing. I don't care that it's his dad. It's still this notion that the federal government is now giving a pass to president kids. Give me your take on this, Steve, and I'm going to get you next, Ted.
Well, Joe Biden is down on crack cocaine unless it's the cocaine found in the White House that may be attached to his son or some of his top senior staffers. Apparently, Dementia Joe got so caught up in pardoning those Thanksgiving turkeys, he just decided to, expand it to his turkey of a son as well and give him this blanket 10-year pardon. Look, this is not about Hunter Biden's crimes. This is about Joe Biden's crimes that extend back to the money he was getting from Hunter's Burisma $1 million a month deal, the Chinese money, the FARA violations, the 10% for the big guy. Joe's brother, Jim Biden, is still under investigation for various healthcare fraud cases. This is all about hiding the Biden crime family, not, exonerating his son from the crimes that he's been convicted of. And I'm predicting that Joe Biden will be forced to pardon himself next. Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution allows the president very broad capacity to grant pardons for federal crimes, except for impeachment. You can't pardon somebody from being impeached, which, by the way, ironically, Donald Trump was impeached for asking for an investigation of the crimes that Joe Biden has just pardoned Hunter Biden for committing. So again, the impeachment can't be foreclosed. But I know that Joe Biden is going to have to pardon himself and others high up in his administration, because this is really about the Biden family cover-up, not about Hunter Biden's crimes.
Ted, give me your take on that. I mean, look, the Hunter Biden laptop was a big deal, and they suppressed that laptop through and through. Divine, the woman that works at New York Times, she has this book, Laptop from Hell, where they point out, it's not the crack, it's not the prostitutes, it's the other stuff that's in that book. And it's, that judge, when he went to court, asked, will you be charging him with a Farrah charge? And they said, maybe. And the other people said no, because they understood Hunter Biden was making all of these deals, leveraging his dad's name to make these deals, Biden Inc. So from your point of view, I mean, is it about the laptop more than his kid, or is it about both? What are your thoughts, Ted?
Oh, it's definitely about both. It covers both. And I think we shouldn't just gloss over the brazenness of this lie, right? I mean, look, both the president and his surrogates and his press secretary have repeatedly stated categorically that he would absolutely not pardon Hunter Biden. And obviously, nothing's changed in terms of the circumstances of Hunter Biden's convictions, his conviction and his pending charges. And yet he's gone ahead and done that. I mean, there's a number of really toxic implications here for the country and for the Democrats. I mean, for the country, you have now both President-elect Trump and President Biden telling the American people that the Department of Justice and by extension the federal government is hopelessly politicized and cannot be trusted. That they've been very clear about that. So both major parties, standard bearers, are now saying that. That's obviously has some major political implications. You also have a lame duck president who basically has made very clear, oh, I lied to you. I intended to do this all along, and I just said whatever in order to make the press shut up. And I know that I'm not going to be held accountable for it. And in fact, the first thing I did this morning was to go look at some of the, mainstream newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post editorial pages to see what kind of commentary there might be. The New York Times has one very half-length editorial by their one of their few conservative commentators that is appropriately outraged, but no further commentary, no editorial. Certainly the liberals are like the birds are, the crickets are chirping. Over at the Washington Post, there's literally there's not a single word. This is a newspaper that spent the last 2 weeks running editorial after editorial about the 50th anniversary of one of its columnists, George Will. Don't get me wrong, George Will is a great writer, but I think this is a little more important than that. And it's gotten absolutely no ink whatsoever on the editorial page of the Washington Post. Look, this is going to this is one of the most breathtakingly cynical moves by an American politician of my lifetime. I'm 61 years old.
Yeah.
It's perhaps as controversial as Gerald Ford's, pardon of Richard Nixon, which I have to admit at the time I criticized vociferously, and for most of my life I was always against. I came to understand the wisdom of it so that the country could move on. This is not something like that. I had advocated that Joe Biden should pardon Trump, actually. I thought it would have been a really nice bipartisan gesture to help the country move on in keeping with the spirit of Gerald Ford. But obviously, this is a disgusting, bitter old man who is just looking out for his own interests and his family's narrow parochial interests. I mean, nothing about any criticism about the Biden crime family, you can't put it aside now. There's just no way to counter it now.
Well, and to Ted's point, Joe Biden wanted to underline that Trump is right about the problems at the Department of Justice and the FBI. I mean, he's like, okay, I'm going to prove it. And to Ted's point about the Miranda Devine book, what changed over the weekend, besides pardoning a couple of turkeys and decided to extend it to Hunter. Hunter apparently threatened over the weekend he was going to write a book and expose all the secrets of the Biden crime family. And that maybe was what the final straw of Joe going, whoa, we can't let that happen. We can't let Hunter start talking. By the way, he loses his Fifth Amendment protections and can now be called before Congress and other agencies to testify about others because he can't plead the Fifth anymore. So This story is not over, which is, again, why I think Joe Biden will have to pardon himself and anybody else who could be implicated in the abuse of the Department of Justice, the FBI, and covering up the Biden family crime syndicate.
What's fascinating about this, Ted, you're absolutely right. Both of you are, actually. It delegitimizes the justice system. Donald Trump and Joe Biden are effectively saying the justice system can't be trusted. They tend to go after people for political ends, because that's Hunter Biden's argument. That's even Joe Biden's argument. They going after my son for political reasons. It has nothing to do with crack. It has nothing to do with the gun charge and lying on the gun charge. I mean, for God's sake, he signed the gun charge saying he was not addicted to any kind of substances while he was addicted to crack. And when they went into court, he argued, well, he wasn't addicted to crack when he filled the gun charge out because he thought that he had been, rehabilitated. The next day, the prosecution shows that he sent a text message saying he was in the car, cracked out. And another text message that he was waiting for Mookie, his crack dealer. It's like, okay, this is utterly outrageous.
But Jamal, he was also using as an excuse for some of the other crimes that he was addicted to crack and didn't have any understanding of what he was doing. Okay, so I'm not on crack when it comes to buying a gun illegally, but I'm on crack when it comes to trying to get sympathy from the American people. And let me underline something Ted said. By the way, it's great to be back with Ted Rawl and you, Jamal, as well. The hypocrisy of the media who spent all these months telling us, oh, there's no way he will pardon Hunter. Karine Jean-Pierre going the obsequious press secretary. There's no way he'll do this. I watched 40 minutes of Morning Joe this morning, just so you guys wouldn't have to watch it. Not one mention of the pardon in 40 minutes.
Well, I suspect they agree. The entire time you saw Joe Biden in that speech is effectively saying if people are doing crack, they need to be put in prison. But when it comes to Hunter, it's a dad who loves his child. That's all it is. Who's had a difficult time in life, who we need to give sympathy to, et cetera, et cetera. Ted, I agree with you thoroughly. Not only does it delegitimize the justice system, it's a deeply cynical move where Joe Biden spent the last year saying he's not going to get involved. They haven't even convicted him, meaning they've convicted him, but they haven't even given a sentence yet, meaning they've punted that to December So we don't even know what sentence Hunter Biden would have received. Hunter Biden might not have even received a jail sentence. And Joe Biden is arguing that all of these people are just after my son and just trying to put him in jail. I think that is utterly outrageous. But nevertheless, that is where we
But
are.
by the way, how
Yeah.
can any Democrat or Republican oppose Kash Patel as FBI director in the wake of this? It ought to be a unanimous vote that, yeah, we got to clean out the FBI, the DOJ, bring back Matt Gaetz as Attorney General, ram these people through, because any pretense that all is well, kind of like that final scene in Animal House, all is not well, you're going to have to rip it out by the roots. Kash Patel ought to float through with 100% support.
Well, let's go into that, Ted. So Donald Trump has said that one of his first things, well, okay, some of his nominees I think are lunatics. Others I like. Tulsi Gabbard, RFK Jr., I like those picks. The other ones I like a little bit less, much less, to be honest. Trump has said the first thing that he's going to do is to deal with the issue of the First Amendment. And what he meant by that is conflating this definition of anti-Semitism with hate speech, basically criticism of Israel being anti-Semitic, and using that as one of his main pillars to go after various people. He's even had people in his administration come out saying, yes, that is going to be one of the things that we do. We are going to go after protesters of Israel. Give me a take on that. Republicans have screamed about censorship. They have screamed about being the party of the First Amendment. Now they're talking about doing this. Isn't that somewhat contradictory? Give me your thoughts, Ted.
Well, it is. I mean, look, you're either for free speech or you're not. And the free speech you have to be the most for is the free speech you disagree with, because that's the stuff that you're going to be likely to want to censor first, right? Unfortunately, and it's a truism, everybody's for their own free speech, and everyone wants to shut up the other side that they disagree with. And this is just another example. It's hard to imagine. I have to admit, I don't, as someone who criticizes Israel, and there's a lot to criticize today in particular, I don't think that I'm not losing any sleep over the idea that Trump's goons are going to come and arrest me for criticizing Israel and accusing me of illegal anti-Semitism, just because I don't think that passes any constitutional muster, even with some, really right-wing conservative judges. I just don't think that'll work. If that's happened, then obviously then we're done and the republic's finished and we could just roll the whole thing up. But if that is, it's not something that gives Republicans any credibility, right? I mean, you get credibility when you say things like, I will fight for the right. I disagree with you, but I'll fight for your right to say, things that I hate to the death. And I think that's not what we have here on either side. Nothing should be protected from criticism. No subject, no group, no country, no nation state, no religion, nothing. And it's dispiriting to see this. I agree with you about the cabinet picks, by the way. I mean, it's really funny because it's like sort of a bizarro world to see the analysis in the media. Oh, Marco Rubio, that's reasonable. I'm like, not to me. RFK Jr., he's crazy. I'm like, yeah, who would ever really want healthy food? That sounds awful. I don't want to. It's like I love eating in Europe. The food tastes better.
Same here.
So yeah, but yeah, no, we'll see what happens, right? I mean, it's also I'm kind of like marveling at the fact that there's just the left. I shouldn't say the left, because the left isn't really in mix here, but liberals and Democrats, they're so despondent these days that they don't really have much to say at all, right? They're just sort of like, oh, well, Trump's coming in. We'll see what happens, and then we'll disagree with him when he comes in. I mean, I almost feel sorry for them. I'm like, come on, like a little spirit here. Like, get some pink pussy hats. Do something.
Well, they've lost on the effing level. They are licking wounds. Steve, give me your take on that. Trump's goons.
Yeah, look, I'm a strong supporter of Israel, and
I
I agree with Ted that you mess with the First Amendment, at your own risk. And again, I think the the efforts to come down on anti-Semitism, while admirable in terms of a talking point, when you start trying to evoke the law to shut down speech you don't like, you're really crossing a big boundary that we shouldn't even get near to. I think you can criticize Israel without being anti-Semitic. I can criticize Northern Ireland without being anti-Catholic, and I think we've got to do a better job of drawing those distinctions. The problem I have is not I have a problem with anti-Semitic speech or any other kind of horrific speech. My problem is when you have colleges and universities or cities who are encouraging that. Again, I can't allow a kid to pray in school because it crosses the line of government involvement, and yet when the government or these state public institutions, colleges and universities, are encouraging or treating this violent anti-Semitic protest on campus as acceptable rather than cracking down on it, both in terms of trespassing, violence, destruction of property. When you're encouraging that kind of speech as a government entity or as a sub-entity as a college or university, that to me is where you cross the line where the government can step in. But if I want to go hold a Palestinian flag on a street corner and scream how I hate Israel, I don't like it, but that's your right.
It's like, God bless, I don't like it. Ted, have these been violent, horrific, property damaging protests in the way Steve has been saying, just rabidly anti-Semitic protests on college campuses that's been encouraged by the colleges? Give me your thoughts.
Yeah, look, I would take issue with that. I agree with Steve, obviously, about the issue of obviously I deplore anti-Semitism. True leftists are absolutely disgusted by anti-Semitism, and it's definitely a no-go zone for people who are truly interested in social justice. That said, Israel is a nation state, and it's like when a nation state engages in a war or various policies of discrimination or whatever that are controversial or subject to criticism, it's not inherently anti-Semitic to call those things out. And I think that to say the least, it's been radically exaggerated that there's a lot of anti-Semitism as part of, or even as any substantial amount of anti-Semitism as part of last spring's college and university protests against Israel's actions in Gaza. Look, have I been to every single minute of every single protest that occurred last spring and summer? Of course not. But I'm always kind of frustrated whenever I hear about these incidents, and they're cited, and I'm like, okay, well, can I please see an example on, we live in a world where everything's being videoed and taped at every single time. You go to the bathroom, someone's got a video of it, I'm sure. And it's like, nobody can show you anything. You can't, it tends to be, well, they said, oh, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free. And I'm like, to say the very least, that's it is far from established that that's an anti-Semitic statement. I would argue
that's
that it's
Likud. That's in their policy. That's like literally Likud's policy. That was in their policy documents. That was one of their objectives, one of their goals. But when the Palestinians said, oh, of course, it's anti-Semitic. I want to go to the Democrats. They are not dealing with this loss well. And if you remember, Bernie Sanders came out and effectively said something vaguely sounding like he wanted a new party, but he criticized them. And the Democrats took umbrage at his criticism. Basically, we have lost the working class. You have lost the working class because you wasn't representing the interests of the working class. Donald Trump got the working class in that last vote. The Teamsters, the majority of them wanted Trump, which is why, for the first time in my lifetime, that they didn't back and support the Democratic Party. This is MSNBC. They have been losing their mind. Joanne Reed says she's not fixing tofurkey for people who voted for Trump, and that she doesn't trust people who voted for Trump, and that you should, dislike your relatives and distrust your relatives. She is losing her mind. This is MSNBC responding to something that Sanders said. Now, they have fake Republican Christopher Steele on here commenting, which is just fantastic. Let's right here.
So you had Bernie Sanders tweeting on Monday If the Democratic Party is to become a Democratic Party, the first job of a new DNC chair is to get the super PAC money out of Democratic primaries. AIPAC and other billionaire-funded super PACs cannot be allowed to select Democratic candidates. They typically don't. They're not going to put their money into a DNC chairman's race. So again, for me, as the former head of a party, as county chairman and a state chairman, that to me is short-sighted thinking about where the landscape is. One thing that has very little to do with the other. Super PACs and all those guys play in elections and campaigns. That's a different conversation than running for chairman and telling the people who are going to write checks, we don't want you writing checks.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. With all due respect to Senator Sanders, you might want to join the party if you want to have something.
Well, there is that.
Like that little part, he might want to join the party before he criticizes the party in this way. Now, what Sanders is saying here is straightforward. His point is, if you are going to allow people to dump all of this money into political campaigns, then that is going to contort the political party and what they go for. And that seeing that the American public looks at the Democratic Party as being an elitist party or a party that is not representative of the working class, maybe the fact that you're getting $1.5 billion to run a race and all of these billionaires are putting money into your pocket, maybe that is altering what you would typically run for. That is his point. Christopher Steele knows that's his point. This woman with the glasses knows that's his point, and yet they're going to attack Sanders for this as opposed to listening to what Sanders is saying. Steve, I want to get your take on this. From your point of view, like political parties are usually decided by the side with the most cash. Do you think that there's a contradiction in the Democratic Party that needs to be addressed in some way? And I know this is a Republican point of view, but I'm curious on how you view all of this argument about campaign donations and how it affects political outcomes in regards to what parties shoot for.
Well, it's interesting that Sanders wants to draw the line when it comes to super PACs, but doesn't have any problem with labor union money that's been dumping billions into Democratic Party races. And this time, their rank and file broke with them. He's not trying to draw the line on Soros money. He's not trying to draw the line on Hollywood money, celebrity money. He just wants to, get rid of the money that Republicans tend to also get as well from these super PACs. I think it's, the money does not just talk in politics, it screams loudly. One of the reasons that Republicans ended up with such a narrow margin in the House is that Democrats outspent Republican House candidates across the country by about a 5-to-1 margin. That's why Republicans didn't pick up more House seats. That and the fact that they're still counting and finding votes in California and these places, several weeks, almost a month after the election, because they're still counting until they get the number they need to win. So they're still converting Republican House seats to Democrat. But the big thing was that 5-to-1 spending advantage in House races. And I'm not hearing Bernie calling for a crackdown on those numbers, including the Act Blue money laundering scheme that has people who, are destitute on welfare that were supposedly, giving tens of thousands of dollars through Act Blue to Democrat candidates.
Ted, what's your thoughts on this? I mean, I got to be honest. Look, from Sanders' point of view, he wants this notion of workers, i.e. labor unions. So yeah, of course he's not going to have an issue with that. He believes that labor unions are representative of the majority of the working class. Zero issue with it. I have zero issue with it. His point is, if you have a Democratic Party, meaning not the Republican Party, a Democratic Party that is supposed to represent the interests of, let's say, the rest of us, as opposed to the top 1%, then maybe you shouldn't be taking money from the 1% in a way that can contort your policies. Ted, give me your take on this. I mean, how do you see it? And how do you see the Democratic resistance to what Sanders is pointing out may be part of the problem of why you've lost the working class?
Well, you can sort of see part of the resistance to it just in the fact that Steele and the other panelists there, pretended not to understand or maybe they didn't understand the content of what Sanders said. They kind of implied that he was talking about the selection process for the Democratic National Committee as opposed to the funding of Democratic primary candidates, which are two completely different things. And Sanders' point is that obviously the party can set rules for what Democratic potential nominees for the presidency what kind of money they can accept and from whom, and that they can and they should. They don't even want to discuss. They can't even frame the argument accurately enough in order to shoot it down. I think Sanders is right. He's usually right about a lot of things. I'm a little bit dismayed that he waited to be safely reelected in this latest cycle for another 6-year term at the age of 83 to finally come out as a super fighter for the liberal cause. But I guess, better, 20 years late than never. But that said, here we are. And, he's right. Like, nothing's going to change here. And I think what he's engaged in, frankly, is an exercise that I'm kind of familiar with, which is he's making an argument that he knows will be rejected. And he's doing it in order to have it publicly rejected so that it's on the record, so that the powers that be who run the Democratic Party are forced to say, yeah, no, we're going to have all these special interests and super PACs run the party because we kind of like it. I think what he's doing, he's clearly signaled in that broadside that he issued the day after the election, he is going to try to launch either a third party or to try to scale up our revolution into some sort of left-wing blue MAGA attempt to take over the Democratic Party from the left.
83? At 83 years old?
I mean, he's an energetic guy.
83?
I know he's an energetic guy, but I'm like, I don't know how energetic he is to be able to do that. I mean, and I think it's like he's not the guy at this time, and I don't even know, frankly, if it can be done. I mean, the Republican Party is more small d Democratic than the Democratic d Democratic Party, because the Republican Party, if they let the winner of the primary win the nomination, when the Republican voters like someone, they put him up. I always point to the election of Arnold Schwarzenegger in the Gray Davis recall election in California. The state GOP did not want Schwarzenegger at all, but when they saw that Republican voters in California liked him, they stepped aside. They didn't put their greasy thumbs on the scale. They let him have the nomination, and he went on to become a very impressive and successful governor. Really what California wanted, which was a liberal Republican. Really kind of makes sense for California at that time, and in many times it made that to me is a model, and that's not possible. Democratic Party with their super delegate process, with all their shenanigans, like feeding the debate questions to their preferred candidate, forgetting to send to send their representatives to the Iowa caucuses. To count the delegates that Bernie Sanders won. Mm-hmm. I mean, this kind of the chair throwing allegations in the Nevada caucuses, all these kind of things. The Republicans don't do that crap. They let their voters decide, and they end up with better candidates. Remember that book, The Emerging Democratic Majority? And it was all reliant entirely on the idea of demographics, that like all the recent arrivals from Latin America were going to probably become Democrats, and that Republicans would become an obsolete national party because there'd be so many registered Democrats. Republicans could just not win except local races in flyover country. That didn't happen. Why? Yeah. Because Democrats decided we don't want to relinquish control to our voters. We want to run things, and it's like, so they end up with candidates like Hillary Clinton and and Kamala Harris, who are weak. One last point I want to really point out. The Democrats, they keep talking about we won in 2020. Like, no, you didn't. Not really. Like, Donald Trump committed suicide in 2020 by telling his voters not to show up for early voting or for mail-in voting in the middle of a pandemic. If he hadn't done that, he would have won. So really, truly, Democrats haven't really won an election since 2012. And if they were aware of that,
and by the way, Trump cost Republicans 2 Senate seats in Georgia by telling people after he got beat in a snit in Georgia, don't go vote in the runoff elections. So he gave 2 Senate seats in Georgia to the Democrats that have been the margin And Republicans would be sitting at 55, 56 seats if he hadn't done that. Now there's a chance Republicans can take one of those back from Ossoff in 2 years. But Donald Trump not only cost a lot of seats in House but Senate races as well. By the way, Jamal, it's the 1% doesn't just give to Republicans. When you talk about the one percenters, the 1% gives to both sides. But only the Democrats give money to the one percenters. Remember, Kamala Harris was giving millions to Beyonce, to Oprah. So the Democrats are the ones who give millions to the one percenters.
You're so right. Steve, I'm going to let you close this out. We have about 30 seconds. What is Trump going to do with the first 100 days when he gets in office? What do you think the main priorities are going to be?
I think the main reason they're jamming everything through with cabinet appointments and others as quickly is they recognize they've got about an 18-month window to get things done. The first 100 days are going to focus on the border, on the criminal illegals, because that was one of the top issues that people were voting on. So that's going to be the key focus. Tom Homan's already been down to the border, something that the Biden border czar, Kamala Harris, never did. So I think the focus is going to be on illegal immigration and getting this economy rolling again. And I think that's going to be the laser focus of the Trump administration the first 100 days.
Guys, thank you for this. I really appreciate it. You guys are my first panel that I've had on the show since coming back. This has been one of the things that I really wanted to do on Fault Lines, and so it's something I want to do on the show. I really appreciate both of you. Steve
Great
Gill.
catching up with you guys.
Thank you so much.
Oh,
Nice
man.
to see you again, Steve.
Thank you. Steve Gill and Ted Ross. Steve Gill is an attorney and CEO of Gill Media, a Nashville, Tennessee-based public affairs media marketing company. He also served as director of intergovernmental affairs. And we have Ted Raw, political cartoonist and syndicated columnist, also host of TMI with Manila Chan, the great, the one and only. Guys, thank you for this. I really appreciate it. You guys have a fantastic day.
Bye, guys.
Thanks.
All right. I want to bring in my next guest. We have KJ No. KJ No, always appreciate you, man. He's a great friend of the show. KJ No is a journalist, political analyst, writer, and teacher specializing in the geopolitics of the Asia-Pacific region. He's a contributor to the book, Capitalism on a Ventilator, once censored by Amazon. It is now available at iacenter.org. Thank you for joining me, KJ. How are you doing this morning? Well, it's not morning for you, but how are you doing it today?
It is morning, and it's a pleasure to be with you.
Oh, man, it's a pleasure to have you. Wait, what time is it where you are?
It's about 6:30 a.m.
Oh, it's so early. I didn't realize it was that early for you. I'm sorry, man. I'm so sorry. What I wanted to talk about was this idea that they are, I can't say bragging, but there seems to be a lot of people putting their ideas out about what Trump is going to do when he gets in office. And Trump hasn't necessarily been talking all that much himself, but his surrogates have been running their mouths pretty heavily. One of the ideas was like 100% tariffs, if I remember correctly. It was some insane number that they were talking about putting on China. I mean, well, to be fair, they said they were going to put tariffs on China, Mexico, and Canada. I don't know what Canada did, but okay, fair enough. But they were talking about like 100% sanctions on China. And, I guess my first question was, okay, well, how many exports is China giving to the United States? Meaning, how much stuff does China give to the U.S.? And is this really going to damage China, or is this going to damage the U.S., especially raising prices across the board over, all through the product stream in the U.S.? Give me your thoughts on this.
Yeah, well, as far as the numbers are concerned, we don't have the full numbers for this year, but the imports are probably in the range of 322 billion, and the exports to China are about 104 billion. So that's a trade deficit of about $200 billion. The previous year, it was about 400 imports and 147 exports. So if you look at those numbers, and we need to be very clear about that, that number constitutes about 2.7% of China's GDP. That is less than one city in China. For example, you take a big city like Shanghai. Shanghai contributes 3.7% of GDP to China. So to put it another way, China does more business with one city than it does with all of the US. And that's just total trade. Remember, the more important figure, trade surplus, that is what China profits from, is about 1.5% of GDP. That's less than $300 billion. And that's the GDP of a medium-sized city in China. So in other words, the Chinese will not be hurt by this if they cut off trade with the United States completely. The US is already preventing most of the valuable products from being exported to China. So China's starting to build them itself, like advanced chips. The largest category of US exports is agricultural products. The largest single one is soybeans, followed by machinery, chemicals, petroleum, etc. China can get most of that from the BRICS, or it can produce it itself. On the other hand, most of what the US imports from China are manufactured goods, electronics, and if the US levies massive tariffs, you can expect massive inflation on consumer goods domestically in an economy where everybody is already struggling to afford things. And so this is very, very dangerous. It's very, very foolish. As we know, if there's 100% tariff levied, it means massive inflation for us. We pay for those tariffs. And if those tariffs are completely successful, as some people think, and China doesn't do any trade with us, then we won't have tariff income to offset the tax cuts that Trump is already proposing. And so there'll be a massive budget deficit, and there'll be all kinds of ripple effects and negative effects. It will not hurt China. China will be fine. It will simply move away, do business with the rest of the BRICS. And we are the ones, in particular, the working classes, will be the ones holding the bag and suffering the worst effects of this.
Yeah, I don't think he seems to be, I mean, for one, he doesn't seem to care about the debt at all. I mean, we're at $35 trillion in debt, and Donald Trump is like no tax on tips, massive tax cuts that, again, are going to go primarily to the top 1%, to the, it's not necessarily going to go to the working class. It's going to effectively go to the 1%. And on top of that, trade wars. Like, he's even talking about trade wars with BRICS countries that decide to de-dollarize. He is arguing that he's going to put tariffs or sanctions on those countries as if that is going to somehow encourage them to deal with the US and to work with the dollar, as opposed to having the opposite effect of saying, okay, the dollar is a liability, and it's a liability that we don't necessarily want to wed ourselves to. Meaning, the policies that Trump is going with, he seems to go with this hubristic idea that the US economy is the end-all be-all, as opposed to the world having changed, where, yeah, the US economy is a juggernaut, but it is not the only player in town, nor is working with the West the only game in town either. This seems to be the thing that will push countries away, not necessarily bring countries closer to the United States. I don't quite get why he doesn't understand that. Give me your take. Is this bravado? Is this escalating to de-escalate? What is your take on this? What is your read on this? Or do you think, no, he really believes that this is going to somehow ingratiate other countries to the US by basically waving his fists at them? Give me your thoughts.
It's hard to understand. The main way that I would read it is that it's a misunderstanding of how the economy works. It's just completely misreading how things work. As you point out, the US is not the only game in town. As I pointed out, if you threaten other countries, they will simply do trade amongst themselves, in particular amongst the BRICS countries. The BRICS countries are energy and resource powerhouses, as well as agricultural powerhouses. They will simply trade amongst themselves. The US will be locked out of that. The US is an economic juggernaut, but if you break it down, it's essentially an economic juggernaut in the domains of FIRE, in finance, insurance, real estate, etc., service economies. These are things that other countries do not find essential. They can create those services for themselves. As far as threatening countries to levy sanctions if they de-dollarize, you are doing exactly the wrong thing. The reason why countries want to de-dollarize is precisely because of these types of threats, because using the dollar puts you at risk of being subject to these types of threats. And if you make more of those threats, other countries will de-dollarize even faster. That said, Trump has said that if they create an alternative currency to the dollar, again, that signals to me that he doesn't understand how international trade works. Countries do not need to have a common currency in order to trade. All they need to do is have ledgers where they record mutual debits and credits, simply a ledger system. And they can do that in mutual currencies, or they can use the dollar as the unit of account. But it doesn't mean that they need to create a third currency as a medium of exchange. So he completely misunderstands the system, and it is going to push countries farther away from working with the United States.
So wait, is that what BRICS is trying to do? Because it didn't seem like they were trying to come up with a currency of their own, like some kind of new currency that they made up with as a combination or a basket of currencies. It sounded like they were trying to come up with a system where they can work in their own currencies when they're doing trade, which I don't quite know how that works. But again, they seem to be putting a lot of energy into finding a way to do this. So is that the plan, to have this kind of ledger?
Yes. Yeah,
no,
you're
wait.
exactly right. The BRICS has said, Trump has said that if you create an alternative to the dollar, alternative, currency to the dollar, I will sanction you. But even before he said that, the BRICS has said we are not going to create an alternative currency. So you can see that the message is not getting through. Now, if we go through this, if we try and unpack this a little bit, money has many different functions. It's a unit of account, and it's a medium of exchange, and it's also a unit of credit. Okay. Now, generally, the theory is that, if you and I are bartering, unless our needs coincide, we cannot barter. Therefore, we need a third commodity, a universal commodity that we can use to facilitate the exchange. This universal commodity is referred to as money. This is money as a medium of exchange. The thing is, you can also say that this applies to countries. When countries want to trade with each other, instead of looking for, barter where they have to have a mutual coincidence of wants, instead they can find some universal commodity, a universal currency here, a global reserve currency with which to buy and pay each other. But this system actually breaks down because you don't actually need this. And in fact, before money was invented, people didn't barter. They simply kept ledgers. They recorded debts, debits, and credits to each other. And so currently, that is what BRICS is preparing. That's what it's building out. It's simply, I give you this, you give me this. We just keep a track, a ledger of what you owe me, what I owe you. And then over the long term, these things either become reconciled or they can get paid down with currency swaps, or if necessary, they can also use dollars regarding, if they have reserves or not. But essentially, they are working on the notion of currency as a unit of account. All that requires is a clearinghouse and a ledger, and not some kind of universal currency as a medium exchange, as people mistakenly think.
That is fascinating, because it seemed that Putin was pushing hard for that. I mean, even showing like the mirror card or something like that, or some kind of card that they were using for BRICS. And you're right. You would think, like, for example, in Russia's case, Russia was one of the most sanctioned countries on the planet. And yet their economy has now moved up to like number 4. And part of that was because Europe damaged itself, but the other part of that was because Russia started building the industries that they were being forbidden from using. And so they were able to create their own items, their own economies around various products that they weren't necessarily being able to get from the West. And same thing with China. The microchip thing is a perfect example. The US says, well, we're not going to allow China to get access to microchips. China said, okay, we'll build them ourselves. And you have this wild situation where Europe has come out and said, we want access to your technologies if you're going to have your businesses here in Europe, which the US called theft. The US said that that was theft, that China was stealing from US technology. Okay, well, now Europe has gotten to the point that this garden, this bastion of Western development, now requires Chinese technology to move forward. It's astonishing the way the world has shifted on this. It's just amazing to me. I want to get into another thing, the Uyghurs. We have heard over and over again that the Uyghurs that China was committing a genocide, that they were putting them in camps, in re-education facilities. They said that this was racist, that they were killing them off and destroying their culture. And one of the most interesting things that I read over the course of the Syrian conflict, that just restarted, was that one of the groups on the ground were the Uyghurs. Now, the Chinese have made this point that these guys are terrorists, they've been radicalized. And yeah, just like the US or any country, we have to do something about the fact that we have a group of radicalized these kind of Muslim warriors that want to take over certain areas of China. This is a problem for us, and we have to deal with it like any country has to deal with it. Like, what the hell are the Uyghurs, who is known to be in China, doing in Syria?
So there are about 5,000, it's estimated, 5,000 Uyghur fighters who are part of this ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Al-Nusra, HTS attack on Idlib and on Syria, on Aleppo. What are they doing there? They are a minor subgroup of the larger Uyghur population that has become radicalized and is dedicated to spreading first Takfiri jihad. That is to say, they want to create a theocratic ethno-state inside of China itself and the adjacent regions, the region that they call Turkestan or East Turkestan. So they want to create their own theocratic state there. Now, that kind of language will not get you anywhere with any sovereign government, but certainly not if you are waging terror, which is what they're doing. They're waging terror in Syria, and they were waging terror inside of China itself. Now, there's a few things you have to understand about Islam in China. China has never had any problems with Islam per se, and that's been the case for over 1,000 years. What China did very, very early is it created a kind of a Confucian structure, which is multi-ethnic and ecumenical, which is to say we have kind of like a secular state, which has a Confucian system. And inside that Confucian system, anybody can worship any god they want. So you see Buddhists, Taoists, Islam, all of these people coexisting peacefully. In fact, in the 15th century, when the first Westerners came to China, they looked at all the Muslims in the Chinese imperial court, and their heads just kind of flipped over because China was not an Islamic state. And yet they marveled at all the Saracens who had high office inside the country. They just couldn't reconcile it because because Europe had just ended, centuries of holy war, crusades against Islam. So that the fact that somehow all these different creeds could coexist was unthinkable for them. But this was something that the Chinese had figured out inside their own system. So Islam goes back over 10 centuries in China. There are over, 10 ethnic groups that are Muslim in faith. And actually, in the Xinjiang region, most of those Muslims are Sufi. They're Sufis, and there are historical reasons for that. That region traditionally was Buddhist, and then it was converted to Islam. And the Islam that has probably the closest affinity to Buddhism is Sufism, or the Sufi practices of Sunni Islam. And so they were largely Sufis, just as, for example, the Buddhists were Zen Buddhists, which is simply an amalgam of Taoism and Buddhism. So there was this kind of coexistence that China had with Islam. Islam is simply part of Chinese culture. There's Islamic Chinese food. There's Islamic Kung Fu martial arts. If you look at the history of China, 4 of the schools of Sufism are indigenous Chinese. And so the Chinese do not have a problem with Islam. What was a problem was that starting in the late 70s, the United States weaponized radical Islam as a way of undermining and overthrowing governments. We saw this in Afghanistan, and then we saw it through Al-Qaeda all over the Middle East. And so this kind of Takfiri Salafist Islam became a weaponized tool against governments that the United States wanted to overthrow. And they repeated the same program in China, creating a massive terror threat inside China proper, inside the Xinjiang region. The Chinese response to this was de-radicalization by improving material conditions. They're, dialectical materialist Marxists. They believe that if you improve material conditions, people's hearts and minds will change. And so that's what they did. They had a pretty extensive system of de-radicalization combined with vocational training, etc. And this created good effects, so much to the extent that there have been no more terrorist attacks since they rolled this program out, starting in 2016, 2017. But the US, which was responsible for this radical terrorism, through the auspices of the CIA and the way that it nurtured Al-Qaeda and ISIS and the ETIM, TIP, all these different groups, started to claim that there was also, when the Chinese put through their de-radicalization movements, they claimed that there was a genocide. Okay, now this is absurd. Because, of course, when the US had problems in 9/11, it went out on a rampage and it attacked the Islamic world and it killed millions of people. China's response was not to go out on a rampage, but to have a program of development and education and counseling. But still, they threw out this absurd charge of genocide. Now, we have to look at this very carefully. There are somewhere in the range of 24 million people in Xinjiang. About 12 million of them are the Uyghur minority. Their population has increased by 25% in the past 2 decades. It has increased over 250% since the start of the People's Republic of China. There are 24,000 mosques in the region. There are 40,000 plus mosques in China per se. Some of the oldest mosques in the world are in China, and they're preserved in perfect condition. And of course, the Uyghurs themselves, not only were they not attacked, but they were excluded from the one-child policy. They could have 2, 3, sometimes more children. They received special benefits as far as employment and education and going to university was concerned. Go to any place in China, any government office, any university, you'll see halal cuisine, halal restaurants specifically for Muslims, and the economy increased, almost doubled. So this is kind of an extraordinary program of development and support. And yet the Mike Pompeo claimed that this was a genocide. And of course, it doesn't pass the smell test. It's absurd. But they wanted to claim that this was a genocide, that millions had been killed, or that millions were held in detention. I just want people to think a little bit more critically about this. China, the Xinjiang Uyghur region, is right next to 8 other countries. It has borders, loose, open borders with 8 other countries. 5 of them are Muslim majority countries. If there were some kind of genocide or even some kind of mass oppression, you would see massive, massive flows of refugees leaving the country. That has never been documented. It doesn't exist. In fact, nobody can even point to a single body in this, quote, genocide. Nobody can even point out to, the structures that are involved. The US has 2.2 million prisoners, held in its prisons. That requires 6,000 buildings. All of these are visible from the air. Nobody has been able to point out where all these people are being held. And if 1 million, 2 million, 3 million people were being incarcerated or had been killed, remember, 12 million people is the Uyghur population in China. About 6 million of them are adults. So if you were talking about 2 or 3 million, you're talking about 50% of the adult population should be missing. And that's certainly not the case, because 100, 200 million people visit Xinjiang every year. And nobody has complained that there is, a massive absence of adults, that there are children without parents. That just doesn't exist. So this is complete and total propaganda from top to bottom. And it contrasts very clearly with the actual genocide that is happening right now in Palestine, where we are seeing
such a good point.
Yeah, we're seeing that nonstop. But these lies are the 2 sides of the same coin. It's the same people and the same mindset and the same hegemonic imperial agenda that denies an actual genocide while playing up a fake, non-existent genocide. These lies are the same, the 2 sides of the same, imperial coin.
I'm so glad you put it that way. Man, that was a good breakdown of that. And like you said, there's an irony in us backing these terrorist groups in one sense, meaning backing the radicalization, while claiming there's a genocide when the country is trying to deal with the fact that these people have been radicalized, while also ignoring the genocide taking place in Israel. KJ, man, always appreciate you. KJ, no, fantastic breakdown. God, man, that, because you don't get that understanding in the States. You get this kind of repeated mantra of genocide. KJ, no, he's a journalist, political analyst, writer, and teacher specializing in the geopolitics of the Asia-Pacific region. He's a contributor to the book, Capitalism on a Ventilator, once censored by Amazon. It is now available at iacenter.org. KJ, man, always appreciate you. Thank you, man.
Thank you. Always a pleasure.
All right. We have come to the end of the show. As we typically come to the end of a show, I always say I'm going to read chats, and I am going to do that today. We have Luis, what's this last name? Oh, I can't see it. Christensen, new member. Welcome to the Thomas family. Welcome to the Thomas family. We also have, I think this is called Son Poppy. House and Poppy. I'm sorry if I'm missing it a bit, but a new member. Again, welcome to the Thomas family. We have Ella JJ. Let me move this so I can see this a little bit better. I'm boycotting YouTube, not the talent. So upset with how they demonetize. Oh, Candace Owens. So I will catch up on PayPal from now on. On topic, our owners are worth 500 trillion. 10 years ago, good luck. Oh, LEJJ, I'm sorry to hear that. Yeah, they monetize many of us, including many of my videos, get demonetized, especially when I'm talking about Israel or something like that. If you feel you need to do so, fair enough. I do understand it. I can't say anything about it. I totally get it. Diane Thomas, super sticker. Is that right? Mama Thomas giving a super sticker. Much appreciated. DC, Palestinians, Arabs. What is this? I am having a hard time saying this. Palestinians, Arabs, Semites, anti-Semitic, to ignore. Well, that's the wild part, right? They always talk about anti-Semitism, but they miss the fact that Palestinians and Arabs are Semitic. When Mike Maloof was on, and he pointed out, I'm a Semitic. Well, he's Lebanese in origin. And so it's like, you know, is it anti-Semitic for Israel to murder all of these Arabs and Semites in the way that they do indiscriminately? Well, I think it is. But again, that's not what you hear in mainstream media on this particular one. Look, my job, as I pointed out, is context. My job is to figure out how to explain some of these issues, to give them the larger context. So whatever decision you come up with, whatever point of view you end up with, that at the very least, that point of view, what's baked into it is that larger understanding of this stuff. And I'm sorry, we have been a bad actor around the globe, and we continue to be a bad actor around the globe. It doesn't do me any joy to say that. I would love to be a triumphalist about us being a force for peace in the world, a moral standard in the world. But I'm sorry, that's what we say. That's not what we do. There's a difference in those things. I'm going to end this. I'm going to say like it, share it, subscribe to it. You can be a member of the Thomas family if indeed that's what you want to do. If you want to support the work through PayPal, Patreon, Super Chat, you can do so also. It is much appreciated. All of it helps keep the show going. Yeah, steeply appreciated. You guys have a great day. I will see you bright and early Tuesday morning. I have a damn good show Tuesday morning. Also, Scott Ritter is going to be here. Mike Maloof is going to be here on Wednesday. And so, yeah, definitely stay tuned. Best damn morning show anywhere you look at it. You guys have a phenomenal day. Jamal Thomas Show, signing off.